in the mists that cling to emerald hills, where ancient stones whisper secrets older than memory itself. There lived kings whose names echo through time like distant thunder. These were not mere mortals crowned with gold, but figures carved from legend itself, beings who walked between worlds, who spoke with gods, and whose very breath shaped the destiny of Ireland. Here, where the veil between myth and history grows thin as morning fog, where sacred groves held councils of both spirits and men, the greatest stories ever told unfold like prayers upon the wind. Tonight, let their voices carry you into dreams, as deep as the Celtic twilight, where heroes rise from shadow and kings are born from starlight. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts just like yours. Long before the first stone was laid upon stone, before the first crown touched mortal brow, Ireland existed in a realm where myth and reality danced together like lovers in the twilight. The island that would become known as Airt emerged from the primordial waters not merely as land, but as a living entity possessed of its own ancient consciousness. The earliest chronicles speak of this emergence in language that transcends the mundane, describing how the very earth breathed with the power of the Otherworld in these primordial times. The concept of kingship was not yet born from human ambition, but from the sacred marriage between the land and those chosen to serve as its guardians. The Irish landscape itself was understood to be a goddess, the sovereignty of Ireland, who would choose her consorts from among those worthy to rule. This divine feminine principle, known by many names including Ariu, Bongba, and Ftela, represented not just the physical territory, but the spiritual essence of the nation itself. The earliest inhabitants of this mystical realm were beings who existed in the space between legend and history, their stories preserved in the ancient texts known as the Leber Gabala Erin, the Book of the Taking of Ireland. These chronicles, compiled by medieval scribes, but drawing from far older oral traditions, tell of successive waves of supernatural peoples who claim dominion over the island, each bringing their own gifts and curses to the land. First among these legendary inhabitants were the Cesair, led by a woman whose name has echoed through Irish tradition as the first to set foot upon the sacred soil. Cesair, daughter of Noah according to some traditions, fled the great flood with her followers, seeking refuge in the westernmost land. Her arrival marked the beginning of Ireland's role as a sanctuary for those seeking escape from the chaos of the wider world. Though her people perished in the deluge that followed, their spirits were said to have merged with the land itself, becoming part of its eternal consciousness. After the waters receded, the island lay empty for generations, its hills and valleys echoing with the memories of those who had come before. The silence was broken by the arrival of Partholón, whose name means the one who causes waves. He came with his people from the eastern lands, bringing with them the first knowledge of agriculture, craftsmanship, and the arts of civilization. Under Partholón's guidance, his followers cleared the first plains, dug the first wells, and established the first settlements. Partholón's reign lasted for 3 centuries, during which time his people multiplied and prospered. They fought the first battles against the Fomorians, the chaotic forces that represented the untamed fury of sea and storm. These conflicts were not merely physical struggles, but cosmic battles between order and chaos, between the civilizing force of human settlement and the wild, primordial energies that sought to reclaim the land. The kingdom of Partholón came to an end not through conquest, but through plague, a reminder that even the mightiest rulers remained subject to forces beyond their control. As his people succumbed, to disease. Partholón himself is said to have died of a broken heart, unable to bear the destruction of all he had built. His death marked the end of the first great age of Irish kingship, but his legacy lived on in the transformed landscape, and the precedent he established for future rulers. The pattern established by Partholón, arrival, settlement, conflict, and transformation would repeat throughout Irish legendary history. Each successive wave of inhabitants brought new elements to the cultural and spiritual landscape of the island, adding layers of meaning and complexity to the evolving concept of Irish sovereignty. Following Partholón came Nemed, whose name signifies the Sacred One. He arrived with his 4 chieftains and their followers, establishing the second great dynasty of legendary Ireland. Nemed's people were renowned for their magical abilities and their deep connection to the Otherworld. They built the first great fortresses, including strongholds that would later become sacred sites for historical Irish kings. Under Nemed's rule, the conflict with the Fomorians intensified. These battles were described in terms that blur the line between historical warfare and mythological struggle. The Fomorians, led by kings whose names evoke the terror of the deep ocean Domnu, Conand and Mork represented forces of destruction and chaos that threatened to overwhelm the ordered world that Nemed's people sought to create. The war between the Nemedians and the Fomorians culminated in a series of devastating battles that left the land scarred and depopulated. The most significant of these conflicts took place at Tory Island, where Nemed's people achieved a Pyrrhic victory, destroying the Fomorian stronghold but suffering such losses that their civilization could not recover. The surviving Nemedians scattered to the 4 winds, some fleeing to distant lands, others disappearing into the hidden places of Ireland, where they would later emerge as the Tuatha de Danann. The departure of the Nemedians left Ireland once again empty, but not unchanged. The battles they had fought, the settlements they had established, and the sacred sites they had consecrated all contributed to the spiritual geography of the island. The land itself had been transformed by their presence, made ready for the next phase of its legendary history. In the years that followed the Nemedian exodus, Ireland lay like a sleeping giant, its ancient powers dormant but not extinct. The island's sacred sites, stone circles, burial mounds, and sacred groves stood as silent witnesses to the civilizations that had risen and fallen. Yet the land was not truly empty, for the Fomorians remained, their dark influence spreading like shadows across the landscape. It was during this period of apparent desolation that the seeds of Ireland's greatest legendary dynasty were planted, far from the Irish shores, in the mysterious northern islands of the world. The descendants of the scattered Nemedians were learning the deepest secrets of magic and kingship. These islands, Falias, Gorias, and Findias, were centers of learning, where the arts of druidry, prophecy, and divine kingship were taught by masters whose wisdom reached back to the very foundations of the world. The exiled Nemedians, now transformed through generations of study and practice, had become something Nuada, Tuatha de Danann, the people of the goddess Danu. Their mastery of the mystical arts had elevated them beyond mere mortals, granting them abilities that would later be remembered as divine powers. They had learned to command the elements, to shapeshift at will, and to travel between the mortal world and the otherworld with ease. Each of the 4 sacred cities contributed to their education and provided them with magical treasures that would define their rule. From Falias came the lyre fail, the stone of destiny, which would cry out when touched by the true king of Ireland. From Gorias came the sword of Nuada, a weapon that could cleave through any armor and from which no enemy could escape. From Murius came the cauldron of the Dogda, which could feed any number of people and whose contents never diminished. From Findius came the spear of Lugh, which never missed its target and which glowed with the light of the sun itself. When the Tuatha Danann finally returned to Ireland, they came not as mere settlers but as divinely appointed rulers. Their arrival was marked by signs and portents that announced the beginning of a new age. The chronicles describe how they landed on the shores of Ireland, shrouded in a mystical cloud that darkened the sky for 3 days and 3 nights, demonstrating their mastery over the natural world. The leadership of the Tuatha Danann was vested in a council of divine kings, each of whom embodied different aspects of ideal rulership. At their head stood Nuada of the Silver Hand, whose name would become synonymous with just and noble kingship. Nuada represented the principle of sacrifice for the greater good. Having lost his hand in battle defending his people, only to have it replaced with a silver prosthetic that became a symbol of his willingness to bear any burden for the sake of his kingdom. The arrival of the Tuatha Danann marked the beginning of Ireland's golden age of legendary kingship. Their rule was characterized by prosperity, justice, and harmony between the mortal and divine realms. Under their guidance, Ireland became a land where the impossible became commonplace, where the seasons followed the wishes of the kings, and where the very stones sang with the joy of righteous rule. However, the return of the Tuatha Danann was not unopposed. The Fomorians, who had grown in power during the long interregnum, saw the newcomers as a threat to their dominion over the island. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine not just the political control of Ireland, but the very nature of reality itself. The tension between these two supernatural peoples represented a fundamental struggle between opposing principles. The Tuatha Danann embodied order, civilization, and the beneficial use of magical power, while the Fomorians represented chaos, destruction, and the terrible forces of untamed nature. This conflict would culminate in the Second Battle of Tuired, a cosmic struggle that would determine the fate of Ireland and establish the template for all future Irish kingship. Among all the legendary kings of Ireland, none exemplified the ideals of noble sacrifice and divine justice more perfectly than Nuada of the Silver Hand. His story begins in the mysterious northern islands where the Tuatha Danann learned their arts, but it truly unfolds upon the green hills of Ireland where he would face the ultimate test of kingship, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the good of his people. Nuada's rise to prominence among the Tuatha Danann was not merely a matter of birthright or political maneuvering. He earned his position through demonstrated wisdom, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Even before the great return to Ireland, Nuada had distinguished himself as a leader who put the needs of his people above his own comfort or safety. His fellow chieftains recognized in him the qualities that marked a true king: the ability to inspire loyalty, the wisdom to make difficult decisions, and the courage to face any challenge. When the Tuatha Danann arrived in Ireland, Nuada was unanimously chosen as their high king. His first act was to establish the principles by which his people would govern the island. Unlike previous rulers who had claimed dominion through conquest alone, Nuada based his authority on the concept of service to the land and its people. He proclaimed that the true king was not one who ruled over others, but one who ruled for others, becoming the servant of the very people who served him. The coronation of Nuada took place at the sacred site that would later become the centre of Irish kingship. The Lugh, the Stone of Destiny, brought from the northern city of Fallius, was placed at the heart of the ceremony. As Nuada approached the stone, the chronicles tell us that the very earth seemed to hold its breath. In anticipation, when the new king's foot touched the sacred stone, it cried out with a voice that could be heard across the length and breadth of Ireland, confirming that the land itself accepted him as its rightful ruler. The early years of Nuada's reign were marked by unprecedented prosperity and peace. Under his guidance, the Tuatha de Danann established a civilization that would become the template for all future Irish culture. They built great halls where hospitality was extended to all who came in peace, established centers of learning where the arts of poetry, music, and druidry were taught, and created a system of laws that balanced justice with mercy. Nuada's court became a magnet for the greatest talents of the age. Bards came from distant lands to sing the praises of the silver-handed king, their songs carrying his fame to the far corners of the world. Craftsmen sought his patronage, creating works of art that surpassed anything seen before or since. Warriors came to serve in his armies, knowing that they would be fighting for a cause greater than mere conquest. The prosperity of Nuada's kingdom was not merely material but spiritual as well. Under his rule, the barrier between the mortal world and the otherworld became more permeable, allowing for greater communication between the living and the divine. The seasonal festivals became grand celebrations that brought together both human and supernatural beings in fellowship and joy. The very landscape of Ireland seemed to respond to the righteousness of his rule, with crops growing more abundantly and the weather following patterns that favored the prosperity of his people. However, this golden age was not to last unopposed. The Fomorians, who had been biding their time in the dark places of the world, began to stir with renewed malevolence. Led by their king Balor of the Evil Eye, they launched a campaign of terror designed to undermine the authority of the Danann and reclaim Ireland for the forces of chaos. The conflict began not with open warfare, but with a series of supernatural attacks designed to test the resolve of the Tuatha de Danann. Crops failed mysteriously, livestock sickened and died, and strange plagues afflicted the people. The Fomorians' magic worked to corrupt the very sources of life, turning the abundance of Nuada's kingdom into scarcity and fear. Nuada's response to these challenges revealed the true depth of his character as a king. Rather than launching immediate retaliation, he first sought to understand the nature of the threat and to protect his people from its effects. He consulted with the greatest druids and prophets of his court, seeking wisdom about how to combat enemies who fought with supernatural weapons. He ordered the construction of protective barriers around the most important settlements and sacred sites, using the combined magical knowledge of his people to create defenses that could withstand Fomorian attacks. When it became clear that the Fomorians would not be deterred by defensive measures alone, Nuada reluctantly began preparations for war. He understood that this would not be an ordinary conflict, but a battle that would determine the very nature of existence in Ireland. The stakes could not have been higher. Defeat would mean not just the end of the Tuatha de Danann's rule, but the triumph of chaos over order, of destruction over creation. The first battle of Mag Tuired began on a morning when the mist hung heavy over the battlefield, as if the very air was reluctant to witness the carnage that was to come. The armies of the Tuatha de Danann faced the hosts of the Fomorians across a plain that would soon be soaked with the blood of gods and monsters. At the center of the Tuatha de Danann battle line stood Nuada himself, his silver hand gleaming in the pale light of dawn. his sword ready to defend everything he held dear. The battle that followed was unlike any conflict in human history. Warriors fought with weapons that blazed with supernatural fire. Magic spells filled the air like deadly storms, and the very ground shook with the force of divine combat. Heroes on both sides performed deeds that would be remembered for millennia, their names carved into the collective memory of Ireland through the sheer magnificence of their courage and sacrifice. It was in the midst of this cosmic struggle that Nuada faced his greatest test. Confronted by Shreng, a champion of the Firbolg who had allied with the Fomorians, the king of the Tuatha, Danann, found himself in single combat with a warrior whose skill matched his own. The duel between these two champions became the focal point of the entire battle, as both armies paused to watch their leaders fight for supremacy. The combat was fierce and prolonged, with neither warrior able to gain a decisive advantage. Strength and skill were legendary, but Nuada fought with the desperation of a king who knew that his people's survival hung in the balance. The duel raged across the battlefield, both champions displaying such prowess that even their enemies paused to admire their skill. The decisive moment came when Shreng's sword struck Nuada's shield with such force that it shattered both the weapon and the king's wrist. As Nuada's severed hand fell to the ground, still clutching his sword, the cry of anguish that arose from the Tuatha, the Danann forces, could be heard across the entire battlefield. Their king, the symbol of their divine authority, had been maimed in the sight of all his people. Yet even in this moment of apparent defeat, Nuada's true greatness shone forth. Rather than retreating from the battle or allowing himself to be consumed by rage, he fought on with his remaining hand, inspiring his warriors with his refusal to yield. His courage in the face of overwhelming pain and the knowledge that his injury might cost him. His throne became a rallying cry for his people. The battle ended in a tactical victory for the Tuatha Danann, but the cost was higher than anyone had anticipated. Nuada's injury had profound implications beyond the immediate physical loss. According to the ancient laws of kingship, a king must be whole in body to rule effectively. A maimed king was considered unlucky, his physical imperfection seen as a sign that he could no longer serve as the perfect representative of the sovereignty of the land. The victory at the first battle of Mag Tuired brought little joy to the Tuatha Danann, for their triumph was overshadowed by the grievous injury to their king. Nuada's severed hand had been a price almost too high to pay, and the implications of his maiming extended far beyond the physical realm. In the ancient understanding of kingship, the ruler's body was mystically connected to the land itself. Any wound to the king was believed to wound the kingdom. Any weakness in the sovereign reflected in the health of the realm. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw Nuada struggling not just with physical pain, but with the weight of tradition and law. The Brehon laws, the ancient legal codes that governed Irish society, were clear on the matter of kingship and physical perfection. A king who was not whole in body could not be whole in authority. The very basis of his right to rule had been called into question by the stroke of Shreng's sword. Despite his injury, Nuada initially attempted to continue his reign as if nothing had changed. His advisors, out of loyalty and respect, said nothing about the obvious difficulties he faced in performing the ceremonial duties of kingship. The daily rituals that connected the ruler to the land became laborious struggles, as tasks that once seemed effortless now required careful adaptation and the assistance of others. The people of Ireland, however, began to notice subtle changes in their world. The harmony that had characterized Nuada's rule seemed fractured, like a beautiful melody played on a broken harp. Crops grew less abundantly, though they did not fail entirely. The weather became less predictable, though it was not yet chaotic. The very stones of the sacred sites seemed to sing with a different voice, one touched by sadness and uncertainty. It was the Druids who first dared to speak the truth, that everyone knew but none wished to acknowledge. Led by the chief Druid, Cathbad, they approached their king with the heavy burden of ancient wisdom. The law was clear. They explained with sorrow in their voices. A king who was not physically perfect could not maintain the spiritual perfection required to rule. The land itself was beginning to reflect his imperfection, and, unless something changed, the prosperity of the realm would gradually fade. Nuada received this news with the same nobility that had characterized his entire reign. Rather than raging against the unfairness of fate or clinging to power despite the consequences, he accepted the judgment of the law and the will of the land. He agreed to step down from the throne, though his heart broke at the thought of abandoning his people in their hour of need. The question of succession proved to be a delicate matter. The Tuatha de Danann possessed many noble and capable leaders, but none seemed to possess the unique combination of wisdom, courage, and divine favor that had made Nuada such an effective ruler. The process of choosing a new king revealed the deep respect and affection that the people held for their injured sovereign time and again. The discussion would return to the question of whether there might be some way to restore Nuada to his former wholeness. It was during these deliberations that a young warrior named Bres came forward with a proposal that seemed to offer a solution to the crisis. Bres was unique among the Tuatha de Danann, for he was of mixed heritage. His father was Elethon, a king of the Fomorians, while his mother was Éber, one of the goddesses of Ireland. This mixed parentage gave him a perspective that encompassed both sides of the cosmic conflict that had defined Irish history. Bres argued that his election as king would bring peace between the Tuatha de Danann and the Fomorians, ending the cycle of warfare that had plagued Ireland for generations. His physical beauty was legendary. He was said to be the most handsome man in all of Ireland, without blemish or flaw. His eloquence in council was renowned, and his skill in battle had been proven in the recent conflict. On the surface, he appeared to be the perfect candidate to replace the injured Nuada. The decision to elect Bres as king was made with great ceremony and apparent enthusiasm. The Leofale cried out when he approached, though some later claimed that its voice was different, more uncertain than the clear, joyful sound it had made for Nuada. The new king was crowned with all the ancient rituals, and the people hoped that a new age of prosperity and peace was about to begin. Initially, Bres's reign seemed to fulfill the promise of his election. He negotiated a truce with the Fomorians, using his family connections to broker agreements that had seemed impossible. Under Nuada's rule, the immediate threat of war receded, and the people of Ireland began to breathe more easily. The new king's court was magnificent, filled with the finest examples of art and culture from both sides of his heritage. However, it gradually became apparent that Bres's understanding of kingship was fundamentally different from Nuada. Where Nuada had seen the throne as a burden to be borne in service to his people, Bres viewed it as a privilege to be enjoyed. The generous hospitality that had characterized the Tuatha de Danann court gave way to a more selfish approach, where the king's comfort took precedence over the welfare of his subjects. The most telling change was in Bres's attitude toward the sacred duties of kingship. The rituals that connected the ruler to the land were performed perfunctorily, without the deep reverence that had characterized Nuada's approach. The seasonal festivals became occasions for the king to display his wealth and power rather than celebrations of the community's connection to the divine, the very essence of Irish kingship. The concept of the ruler as the servant of the people seemed to have been forgotten. Meanwhile, Nuada had retired to a secluded dwelling where he could contemplate his fate and seek healing for his injury. He refused to accept the pity of his former subjects, instead focusing his energy on understanding the deeper meaning of his loss. The retired king spent his days in study and meditation, consulting with the wisest druids and healers in search of wisdom that might help him serve his people in some new way. It was during this period of contemplation that Nuada was visited by Dion Ccht, the divine physician of the Tuatha, the Danann. Dion Ccht's healing powers were legendary throughout Ireland, and his knowledge of both natural and supernatural medicine was unparalleled. The god-physician examined Nuada's injury with the careful attention of one who understood that this was more than merely a physical wound, was a spiritual crisis that threatened the very foundations of Irish kingship. The healing process that Dion Ccht proposed was unlike any treatment that had been attempted before. Rather than simply trying to restore the severed hand, he suggested creating a replacement that would be even more perfect than the original. Using the most advanced techniques of his art, combining magical knowledge with practical skill, he would craft a hand of silver that would be permanently attached to Nuada's arm. The creation of the silver hand was a work of art as much as medicine. Dion Ccht began by fashioning the basic structure from the finest silver, metal that was sacred to the moon and associated with purity and divine power. Each finger was crafted with meticulous attention to detail, from the broad strength of the thumb to the delicate sensitivity of the little finger. The palm was engraved with symbols of protection and power, while the back of the hand bore the markings of royal authority. The most challenging aspect of the process was not the physical crafting, but the magical binding that would make the silver hand truly functional. This required not just Dion Ccht's expertise, but the cooperation of the most skilled druids and the blessing of the gods themselves. The ritual of attachment took place during the full moon, when the silver would be most receptive to the divine influences that would animate it, as the silver hand was joined to Nuada's arm. Witnesses reported that the very air seemed to shimmer with supernatural energy. The metal warmed under the touch of divine power, taking on a life of its own as it became part of the king's body. When the process was complete, Nuada found that his new hand was not just functional, but possessed abilities that exceeded those of mortal flesh. The silver fingers could sense things that were invisible to the naked eye, could touch the supernatural realm, and could channel the power of the gods themselves. The restoration of Nuada's physical wholeness had profound implications. For the kingdom, the former king now possessed not just his original authority, but enhanced abilities that marked him as truly divine. His silver hand became a symbol of the transformation that could emerge from apparent defeat, proof that even the most devastating losses could be turned into sources of new strength. Word of Nuada's healing spread quickly throughout Ireland, and the people began to whisper that perhaps their beloved king might return to them. The contrast between his sacrificial nobility and Bres's selfish rule became increasingly apparent, and many began to question whether the change in leadership had truly been for the better. While Nuada underwent his miraculous healing, the reign of Bres revealed its true nature with each passing season. What had initially appeared to be a golden age of peace and prosperity gradually transformed into a period of oppression and spiritual decay. The king's Fomorian heritage, which had seemed like a bridge between warring peoples, instead became a channel through which the chaotic influences of his father's people began to corrupt the realm. The first signs of trouble appeared in the royal court itself, The generous hospitality that had been the hallmark of the Danann civilization began to disappear under Bres's rule. Where once the great halls had been open to all who came in peace, now admission was restricted to those who could offer appropriate tribute to the king. The ancient Irish principle of universal hospitality, the sacred duty to feed and shelter any guest, was replaced by a system of patronage that served the king's interests rather than the needs of the people. The poets and bards, who had always held a place of honor in Irish society, found themselves particularly affected by the change. Under Nuada's rule, they had been valued for their ability to preserve and transmit the culture of the people, their words carrying the weight of divine inspiration. Bres, however, viewed them with suspicion, seeing their traditional role as critics and truth-tellers as a threat to his authority. The situation came to a head when Cormac, the chief poet of the Tuatha de Danann, visited Bres's court expecting the traditional welcome accorded to one of his rank. Instead, he was housed in a small, dark chamber without fire or furniture, given only stale bread and water for sustenance. This treatment of a figure who held such an important position in Irish society was not merely discourteous, which is a violation of the sacred laws that governed the relationship between rulers and their people. Cooper's response to this insult became one of the most significant moments in Irish legendary history. Rather than accepting the slight in silence, he composed a satirical poem that captured the essence of Bres's failures as a king. The poem, known as the first satire ever composed in Ireland, was a masterpiece of poetic justice that used the power of words to expose the corruption of the throne. The satire spread throughout Ireland like wildfire, carried by travelling bards and whispered in every settlement. Its power lay not just in its clever wordplay, but in its ability to articulate what many people had begun to feel but had been unable to express. The poem gave voice to the growing discontent with Bres's rule, transforming individual grievances into a collective understanding of the king's failures. The supernatural power of the satire manifested in physical ways as well. According to the chronicles, 3 blisters appeared on Bres's face after the poem was composed, blisters that could not be healed by any medicine or magic. These marks served as visible proof of the poet's words, a sign that the land itself was rejecting the king's authority. The physical manifestation of the satire's power demonstrated the deep connection between artistic expression and political reality in ancient Irish culture. As Bres's reign continued, the oppression of the Tuatha de Danann became more systematic and severe. The king's Fomorian relatives began to demand tribute from the Irish people, treating the island as a conquered territory rather than a homeland. The tribute demanded was not merely material, but spiritual. The Fomorians sought to drain the very life force from the land, leaving it as barren and chaotic as their own underwater realm. The noble chieftains of the Tuatha de Danann found themselves reduced to the status of servants in their own land. Warriors who had once commanded respect and honor were forced to perform menial tasks for their Fomorian overlords. The Dogda, the great father god of the Irish people, was compelled to build a fortress for the Fomorian king Balor, his divine strength exploited for the benefit of his people's enemies. The most degrading aspect of the oppression was the way it targeted the spiritual foundations of Irish culture. The sacred sites that had been centers of worship and learning under Nuada's rule were now monitored and controlled by Fomorian overseers. The seasonal festivals that had celebrated the connection between the people and the land were corrupted into occasions for paying tribute to foreign gods. The very soul of Irish civilization was being systematically destroyed. Ogma, the champion of the Tuatha de Danann, and the inventor of the Ogma script, was forced to carry firewood for the Fomorian court. This humiliation of the god of eloquence and strength was particularly tirelessly represented the silencing of Irish culture and the reduction of its greatest figures to mere labourers. The sight of Ogma, bent under the weight of his burden, became a powerful symbol of the degradation that had befallen the once proud people. The oppression extended beyond the nobility to affect every level of Irish society. Farmers were forced to give up the best portions of their harvests to feed the Fomorian occupiers, leaving barely enough for their own families to survive. Craftsmen were compelled to work on projects that served their oppressors' interests rather than their own. Communities, the ancient systems of law and justice that had maintained order in Irish society, were replaced by arbitrary decrees that served the convenience of the ruling elite. Perhaps most tragically, the spiritual connection between the people and the land began to weaken under the weight of oppression. The island that had once been a paradise, where the divine and mortal realms coexisted in harmony, became a place of fear and uncertainty. The very landscape seemed to reflect the sorrow of its people. The grass grew less green, the streams flowed more slowly, and the ancient stones that had once sung with joy now stood silent and grey-dot. It was during this dark period that whispers began to circulate about Nuada's miraculous healing. The news that the silver-handed king had been restored to wholeness spread through the oppressed communities like a beacon of hope in the darkness. People began to speak in hushed voices about the possibility of change, about the chance that their beloved former king might return to liberate them from the tyranny of Bres. The growing discontent with Bres's rule coincided with increasing pressure from the Fomorians for even greater tribute and submission. Balor of the Evil Eye, the most terrible of the Fomorian kings, had begun to take a more active interest in Irish affairs. His involvement brought with it the threat of far worse oppression, as his power to kill with a single glance made him a figure of absolute terror. The situation reached a crisis point when Bres demanded that the Tuatha de Danann surrender their magical treasures, the very items that had been brought from the 4 sacred cities and that represented the spiritual heritage of the people. This demand was not merely about the transfer of powerful artifacts, but about the complete spiritual subjugation of the Irish people. Without their sacred treasures, the Tuatha de Danann would be cut off from the sources of their power and reduced to helpless vassals. The chiefs of the Tuatha de Danann gathered in secret council to discuss their response to this ultimate demand. The debate was intense and emotional, with some arguing for submission to avoid even worse consequences, while others called for resistance regardless of the cost. The discussion continued through the night, with the fate of Irish civilization hanging in the balance. It was during this crucial council that a messenger arrived with news that would change everything. Nuada, the silver-handed king, had emerged from his seclusion and was calling for the restoration of rightful rule in Ireland. The time had come for the Tuatha de Danann to reclaim their homeland and their heritage. The long night of oppression was about to end, but the dawn would bring with it the greatest battle in Irish history, the Second Battle of Tuired, where the fate of Ireland would be decided once and for all. The stage was set for a conflict that would transcend mere political change. This would be a battle between 2 fundamentally different visions of reality. The Tuatha de Danann's vision of Ireland as a sacred land where order and beauty could flourish, and the Fomorian vision of a world dominated by chaos and exploitation. The outcome would determine not just who ruled Ireland, but what kind of place Ireland would become for all future generations. As the people of Ireland prepared for the coming conflict, they looked to their restored king with hope and determination. Nuada's silver hand had become a symbol of transformation through suffering, proof that even the most devastating losses could become sources of new strength. The time had come for the silver-handed king to lead his people back to the light, to restore the harmony that had been broken, and to ensure that the sacred land of Ireland would never again be subjected to the tyranny of those who would exploit its people and desecrate its holy places. The winds that carried the Tuatha, the Danann to Ireland's shores bore more than ships and warriors. They carried the breath of other worlds, the whisper of magic that would seep into the very stones of the land. These were not merely conquerors seeking territory, but divine beings whose arrival would transform Ireland from a realm of mortals into a bridge between earth and the eternal. In the mists of time, when the boundaries between myth and memory were as thin as morning fog, the Tuatha descended upon Ireland like stars falling to earth. Their coming was not heralded by trumpets or the thunder of approaching armies, but by subtle signs that those who knew how to read the language of the land could interpret. Birds flew in patterns that spelled ancient words. Rivers changed their courses overnight. The very air shimmered with possibility. The Firbolg, who had ruled the land before them, felt the change in their bones. They were a people of the earth, strong and enduring, but they recognized in the approaching strangers something that transcended the mortal realm. The Tuatha the Danann possessed what the ancient texts called the four great treasures, the Lyre Fail, the stone of destiny that would cry out when touched by the rightful king, the Claiumi Solais, the sword of light that guaranteed victory to whoever wielded it, the Slibua, the spear of law that never missed its mark, and the Qua Ansik, the cauldron of the Dogda that could feed any number without ever being emptied. These were not mere weapons and tools, but symbols of a power that connected the earthly realm to the divine. Each treasure represented an aspect of kingship that would echo through all the ages of Irish rule that followed. The stone spoke of legitimacy, the sword of protection, the spear of justice, and the cauldron of abundance. Together, they embodied the sacred contract between ruler and ruled, between the mortal king and the eternal forces that governed the fate of nations. The first among the Tuatha the Danann to claim the title of king was Nuada of the Silver Hand, whose very name became synonymous with the noble bearing that would define Irish kingship for centuries to come. Nuada's reign began with the great Battle of Mag Tuired, where the old order met the new in a clash that would determine the spiritual destiny of the island. The battle was not merely a conflict between two armies, but a contest between different ways of understanding the relationship between the human and divine realms. The Firbolg fought with the strength of men who knew every stone and stream of their homeland, while the Tuatha the Danann wielded powers that seemed to bend the very laws of nature to their will. When Nuada's hand was severed in the fighting, it was not simply a wound, but a symbol of the price that leadership demanded. The healing of Nuada's wound became the first great demonstration of the magical arts that the Tuatha the Danann brought to Ireland. Dion Ccht, the divine physician, crafted for the king a hand of silver that moved and felt as though it were flesh and blood. This silver hand became more than a replacement for what was lost. It became a symbol of the way divine kingship could transform even loss into something greater than what had been before. Yet the silver hand, for all its wonder, was not enough to satisfy the sacred requirements of kingship among the Tuatha the Danann. Their law demanded that their king be physically perfect, without blemish or flaw. This requirement was not born of vanity, but of a deep understanding that the king's body was a reflection of the health of the land itself. When Nuada's hand was healed completely by the physician Myarch, son of Dion Ccht, it marked not just the restoration of a king, but the establishment of a principle that would echo through Irish political thought for generations. The reign of Nuada established the pattern that would define the relationship between the Tuatha, the Danann, and the land they had claimed. His court at Terra became the first of the great royal centres that would serve as both earthly palace and spiritual nexus. Here, the king held court not merely over his human subjects, but over the spirits of the land itself. The ancient texts speak of how the very stones of Terra would sing when the rightful king approached, and how the rivers would flow more sweetly when the kingdom was well governed. Under Nuada's rule, the Tuatha de Danann established the great festivals that would mark the turning of the seasons and the renewal of the sacred compact between ruler and realm. Samhain, when the veil between worlds was thinnest, became the time when the king would commune with the spirits of the ancestors and receive guidance for the coming year. Beltane marked the renewal of fertility and the blessing of the crops, while Lugh celebrated the first harvest and the abundance that good governance could bring. These festivals were not mere celebrations, but ceremonies that reinforced the cosmic order that placed the king at the center of a web of relationships that extended from the humblest farmer to the most exalted of the otherworld beings. The king was not simply a political leader, but a priest-king, whose actions affected the very fabric of reality. A just king brought prosperity and peace, while a false king brought drought, famine, and the breakdown of the natural order. The wisdom of Nuada's reign was tested when the Tuatha de Danann faced a new threat from the sea. The Fomorians, ancient beings of chaos and destruction, rose from the depths to challenge the order that the divine kings had established. These were not enemies that could be defeated by conventional warfare, for they represented the primal forces of entropy that constantly threatened to return the world to primordial chaos. The coming of the Fomorians forced the Tuatha de Danann to confront the fundamental question of their kingship. Was their rule based merely on superior power, or did it represent a higher principle that could stand against the forces of destruction? The answer would come through the actions of Lugh, the long-armed one, whose arrival at the court of Terra would usher in a new age of Irish kingship. When Lugh approached the gates of Terra, he came not as a conqueror, but as a master of all arts, a figure whose very presence seemed to illuminate the deepest mysteries of royal authority. The doorkeeper, following the ancient custom, challenged him to declare what skill he possessed that would earn him a place at the king's table. Lugh's response became legendary. He claimed mastery of every art known to the Tuatha de Danann, and when challenged on each claim, he proved his words with demonstrations that left the court in wonder. This was not mere boasting, but a declaration of a new kind of kingship. Where previous rulers had been masters of war or magic or wisdom, Lugh represented the synthesis of all royal virtues. He was warrior and poet, craftsman and judge, musician and strategist. His kingship would be based not on the dominance of a single quality, but on the harmonious integration of all the skills that a true king required. The test of Lugh's kingship came with the second battle of Mag Tuired, where the Tuatha de Danann faced the full might of the Fomorians. This was not simply a military campaign, but a cosmic conflict between the forces of order and chaos, between the light of civilization and the darkness of primordial destruction. The battle would determine not just who ruled Ireland, but what kind of world Ireland would become. Lugh's preparation for the battle revealed the depth of his understanding of royal responsibility. He did not simply gather armies and weapons, but sought to align every aspect of his kingdom with the cosmic forces that governed victory and defeat. He consulted with the Druids about the most auspicious times for battle, with the poets about the words of power that could inspire his warriors, with the craftsmen about the forging of weapons that would serve not just as tools of war, but as symbols of the divine order they fought to preserve. The battle itself was fought on multiple levels. On the physical plane, warriors clashed with weapons of bronze and iron, their blood soaking the fields of Tuired. But on the spiritual level, it was a contest between different visions of what the world should be. The Fomorians sought to return Ireland to the primordial chaos from which it had emerged, while the Tuatha Danann fought to establish a realm where divine order could flourish in harmony with the natural world. Lugh's victory over Balor of the evil became the defining moment of his reign and a template for how divine kingship should respond to the forces of destruction. Balor's eye, which could kill with a glance, represented the power of death and negation that constantly threatened to overwhelm the creative forces of life. When Lugh cast the stone that struck Balor in his deadly eye, it was not just a skillful shot but a symbolic act that demonstrated the power of focused will and divine purpose over the scattered forces of chaos. The aftermath of the battle saw the establishment of what would become the golden age of the Tuatha Danann. Under Lugh's rule, Ireland became a land where the boundaries between the human and divine realms were most permeable, where mortals could converse with gods, and where the very landscape seemed to pulse with magical energy. The hill forts that dotted the countryside became centers not just of political power but of spiritual learning, where the Druids taught the laws that governed both the seen and unseen worlds. Lugh's court at Terra became a model for how a divine king should govern. Justice was not merely a matter of punishing wrongdoers, but of maintaining the cosmic harmony that kept the natural world in balance. The king's judgment hall was built according to principles that reflected the structure of the universe itself, with each corner representing one of the four directions and each pillar embodying one of the cardinal virtues that a ruler must possess. The laws that Lugh established became the foundation for all subsequent Irish legal tradition. These were not merely human regulations, but reflections of the divine order that governed the cosmos. The law of hospitality, which required that every household offer shelter and sustenance to travelers, reflected the cosmic principle that abundance should be shared rather than hoarded. The law of truth, which demanded that oaths be kept and contracts honored, mirrored the cosmic principle that the universe itself was held together by the reliability of natural law. Under Lugh's rule, the arts flourished as never before. The poets, who served as both entertainers and repositories of sacred knowledge, developed new forms of verse that could capture the ineffable truths of the divine realm in words that mortals could understand. The craftsmen, inspired by the divine prototypes of their tools and techniques, created works of beauty that seemed to glow with inner light. The musicians learned to play melodies that could heal the sick, inspire the brave, and open doorways between the worlds. The prosperity of Lugh's reign was not merely material, but spiritual. The ancient texts speak of how the cattle grew fat without need of fodder, how the rivers ran with ale as well as water, how the trees bore fruit in every season. These were not mere fairy tales, but symbolic representations of what happened when the divine order was properly established and maintained. When the king ruled justly, the land itself responded with abundance. Yet even in the golden age of Lugh's reign, the seeds of change were already being sown. The Tuatha Danann, for all their divine nature, were not immune to the law of transformation that governed all things. The very perfection of their rule contained within it the necessity of its own transcendence. The world was changing, and new peoples were approaching Ireland's shores, bringing with them new challenges and new possibilities. The coming of the Milesians represented not just a new conquest, but a new phase in the spiritual evolution of Ireland. These were not merely mortal warriors, but the ancestors of the Irish people, carrying within them the potential to bridge the gap between the human and divine realms in new ways. Their arrival would force the Tuatha de Danann to confront the ultimate question of their kingship. Was their rule meant to be eternal, or was it a phase in a greater cosmic plan that required them to step aside for a new order to emerge? As Lugh's reign reached its zenith, the mantle of kingship passed to one whose very name embodied the profound mysteries of divine rule. The Dogda, known as the Good God, assumed the throne not through conquest or inheritance, but through the recognition of his peers that he alone possessed the wisdom necessary to guide the Tuatha de Danann through the challenges that lay ahead. The Dogda's kingship was different from that of his predecessors. Where Nuada had established the principle of physical perfection and Lugh had demonstrated the integration of all royal virtues, the Dogda embodied something more fundamental, the eternal sustaining power that kept the cosmos in being. His very presence seemed to anchor the divine realm to the material world, ensuring that the blessings of the Otherworld would continue to flow to those who dwelt in the land of mortals. The symbol of the Dogda's power was his great cauldron, which could feed any number of people without ever being emptied. This was not merely a magical vessel, but a representation of the cosmic principle of abundance that lay at the heart of just kingship. A true king, the Dogda's reign demonstrated, was not one who hoarded wealth and power, but one who ensured that the blessings of his rule flowed to all his subjects, regardless of their station or merit. The Dogda's court was characterized by a kind of rustic wisdom that stood in sharp contrast to the sophisticated elegance of Lugh's reign. Where Lugh had been the master of all arts, the Dogda was the master of the fundamental truths that underlay all artistic expression. His harp could play three melodies, one that brought sleep, one that brought laughter, and one that brought tears. These were not mere entertainment, but expressions of the three great truths that governed mortal existence: the need for rest, the gift of joy, and the inevitability of sorrow. Under the Dogda's rule, the Tuatha de Danann learned to live in harmony with the natural cycles that governed all existence. The king's year was structured around the great festivals, each marking a crucial moment in the cosmic cycle. At Samhain, when the veil between worlds was thinnest, the Dogda would commune with the spirits of the ancestors and receive guidance. For the coming year, at Imbolc, the festival of the returning light, he would renew the sacred fires that kept the spiritual energy of the kingdom flowing. At Beltane, the celebration of fertility and growth, he would bless the unions that would ensure the continuation of the people. At Lugh, the harvest festival, he would give thanks for the abundance that the land had provided. The Dogda's understanding of kingship was deeply rooted in the recognition that the ruler was not separate from the ruled, but was, in the deepest sense, their representative before the cosmic forces that governed existence. When he made decisions, he did so not from his own will, but from his understanding of what the deepest needs of the land and people required. His wisdom lay not in his ability to impose his will, but in his capacity to discern the will of the cosmos and align his actions with it. This approach to kingship was tested when the Dogda faced the most profound challenge that any ruler could encounter: the approach of forces that would fundamentally alter the nature of the realm he governed. The Milesians, the ancestors of the Irish people, were approaching from the south, bringing with them not just superior numbers, but a new understanding of the relationship between the human and divine realms. The Dogda's response to this challenge revealed the deepest wisdom of his kingship. He recognized that the coming of the Milesians was not a catastrophe to be resisted, but a transformation to be embraced. The time of the Tuatha, the Danann, as the visible rulers of Ireland, was drawing to a close, but this did not mean that their influence would end. Instead, it would take new forms, working through the new rulers and the new people who would inherit the land. The negotiations between the Dogda and the Milesian leaders became a model for how a wise king should handle the transfer of power. Rather than fighting a hopeless battle against the forces of change, the Dogda sought to ensure that the transition would preserve what was valuable from the old order while allowing the new order to flourish. He recognized that the true treasure of the Tuatha, the Danann, was not their political power but their spiritual wisdom, and this wisdom could be preserved even as the forms of government changed. The famous division of Ireland between the two, the Danann and the Milesians, was not a defeat but a transformation. The Tuatha, the Danann, would rule the Otherworld, becoming the spiritual guardians of the land, while the Milesians would rule the visible world, becoming the political leaders of the people. This division ensured that both the practical and spiritual needs of the kingdom would be met, with each group contributing their unique gifts to the welfare of the whole. The Dogda's wisdom in arranging this transition was demonstrated by its results. The Irish people who descended from the Milesians inherited not just the land, but the spiritual traditions of the Tuatha, the Danann. The Druids who served the mortal kings preserved the magical knowledge of the divine rulers. The poets who sang in the halls of earthly monarchs echoed the songs that had once been heard in the court of terror. The craftsmen who worked for human masters continued to create objects that seemed to glow with otherworldly light. As the Dogda's reign drew to its close, he established the principles that would guide the relationship between the visible and invisible rulers of Ireland for centuries to come. The mortal kings would draw their legitimacy from their connection to the divine realm, while the Tuatha de Danann would ensure that the spiritual forces necessary for good government continued to flow. To those who ruled justly, the two realms would be separate but not divided, distinct but not disconnected. The Dogda's final act as king was to ensure that the great treasures of the Tuatha, the Danann, would continue to serve the people of Ireland even after the divine kings had withdrawn from direct rule. The Stone of Destiny would remain at Tara, crying out when the rightful king approached. The other treasures would be preserved in the Otherworld, available to those mortal rulers who proved themselves worthy of divine assistance. The legacy of the Dogda's kingship was not a collection of laws or monuments, but a way of understanding the relationship between power and responsibility that would echo through all subsequent Irish political thought. He had demonstrated that true kingship was not about domination, but about service, not about taking, but about giving, not about ruling over, but about ruling for. His example would inspire the greatest of the mortal kings who followed, from Niall of the Nine Hostages to Brian Boru, each of whom sought to embody in their own way the principles of divine kingship that the Dogda had established as the age of the Tuatha de Danann drew to its close. The stage was set for one of the most profound transformations in the spiritual history of Ireland. The coming of the Milesians represented not merely a change of rulers, but a fundamental shift in the nature of kingship itself. Where the Tuatha, the Danann, had ruled as gods among mortals, the new kings would rule as mortals touched by the divine, forever reaching toward the other world for the wisdom and power necessary to govern justly. The leader of the Milesians was a Ugaine, a figure whose very name would become synonymous with the transformation of Ireland from a realm of gods to a realm of humans blessed by divine presence. Ugaine was not merely a warrior, but a druid poet, whose understanding of the spiritual forces that governed the land equaled that of the Tuatha Danann themselves. His arrival on Ireland's shores was marked not by battle cries, but by the recitation of a poem that seemed to claim not just the land, but the very essence of what it meant to be Irish. The poem that Ugaine spoke as he first set foot on Irish soil became the foundation charter of mortal kingship in Ireland. In it, he declared himself to be all things: the wind on the sea, the wave on the shore, the roar of the ocean, the bull of 7 battles, the eagle on the cliff, the dewdrop in the sun, the fairest flower, the salmon in the pool, the lake on the plain, the word of knowledge, the point of a spear, the god who fashions fire in the head. This was not boasting, but a declaration of the mystical union between king and land that would define Irish kingship for centuries to come. The initial encounters between the Milesians and the Tuatha Danann were marked by a subtle testing of spiritual power rather than crude displays of military might. The Tuatha Danann, recognizing that these new arrivals possessed a different kind of strength, sought to turn them away through enchantments and illusions. They caused fogs to rise that obscured the coastline, making it impossible for the Milesians to find safe harbor. They summoned storms that threatened to dash the invading fleet against the rocks. They created phantom armies that seemed to outnumber the real warriors of the Milesians by 10 to 1. But Ugaine and his followers were not ordinary mortals. They possessed their own understanding of the spiritual forces that governed the natural world, and they met each challenge with wisdom rather than force. When the Tuatha Danann raised fogs, Ugaine spoke words of power that cleared the air. When they summoned storms, he called upon the winds to carry his ships to safety. When they created phantom armies, he dispelled the illusions with the light of truth that burned in his druidic knowledge. The decisive moment came when the two groups met for formal negotiations. The Tuatha Danann, recognizing that they could not turn away these new arrivals through trickery or force, agreed to meet them according to the ancient laws of hospitality and fair dealing. The negotiations that followed established the pattern for all future relationships between the mortal and divine realms in Ireland. The terms of the agreement were deceptively simple but profoundly significant. The Tuatha Danann would withdraw from direct rule of the visible world, but they would remain as the spiritual guardians of the land. They would dwell in the Otherworld, in the SD mounds that dotted the landscape, and from there they would continue to influence the affairs of mortals. The Milesians would become the visible rulers of Ireland, but they would draw their legitimacy from their connection to the divine realm and their adherence to the principles of justice and wisdom that the Tuatha Danann had established. This division of responsibilities was not a defeat for either side, but a recognition that the spiritual evolution of Ireland required both groups to play their appropriate roles. The Tuatha Danann, as beings of the Otherworld, were naturally suited to serve as the guardians of the eternal principles that governed just rule. The Milesians, as mortals with one foot in the material world and one in the spiritual realm, were uniquely qualified to serve as the bridge between the needs of the people and the wisdom of the divine. The first of the mortal kings to rule according to these new principles was Éremon, Umaine's brother, whose reign established the precedents that would guide Irish kingship for generations to come. Éremon's coronation was unlike any that had come before, for it required not just the acclaim of his warriors, but the blessing of the Tuatha de Danann. The ceremony took place at Terra, with representatives of both the mortal and divine realms, participating in rituals that bound the new king to the sacred obligations of his office. The crowning of Éremon marked the beginning of a new understanding of what it meant to be a king in Ireland. Unlike the divine kings who had ruled before him, Éremon was clearly mortal, subject to the same physical limitations and emotional struggles as his subjects. Yet his kingship was no less sacred for being mortal. Indeed, his mortality became part of what made his rule meaningful, for it demonstrated that even mortals could embody the divine principles of justice, wisdom, and compassion if they remained connected to the spiritual sources of their authority. Éremon's reign was characterized by a careful balance between innovation and tradition. He established new laws and customs that reflected the practical needs of a mortal society. But he ensured that these innovations were grounded in the eternal principles that the Tuatha de Danann had established. He created new institutions of government that could function effectively in the material world, but he maintained the spiritual practices that kept the kingdom connected to the otherworld sources of wisdom and power. The challenge of Éremon's reign was to demonstrate that mortal kingship could be as effective and beneficial as divine rule had been. The people of Ireland, accustomed to the magical abundance that had characterized the age of the Tuatha de Danann, needed to be convinced that mortal rulers could provide the same blessings of peace, prosperity, and spiritual guidance. Éremon met this challenge not by trying to match the supernatural powers of his predecessors, but by showing that human dedication and divine wisdom could work together to create a just and prosperous society. The festivals that Éremon established became the model for how mortal kings should maintain their connection to the divine realm. These celebrations were not mere entertainment, but carefully structured rituals that renewed the spiritual bonds between the visible and invisible rulers of Ireland. At each festival, the king would perform ceremonies that acknowledged his dependence on the otherworld for the wisdom and power necessary to govern justly. The success of Éremon's reign was measured not in military victories or territorial expansion, but in the establishment of a stable and harmonious society. The ancient texts speak of how the land flourished under his rule, how disputes were settled justly, how the arts and crafts reached new heights of achievement. These were signs that the transition from divine to mortal rule had been successful, that the spiritual forces that had blessed Ireland under the Tuatha de Danann continued to flow through the new institutions of government. As Éremon's reign drew to its close, he established the principles that would guide the succession of mortal kings in Ireland. The crown would pass not necessarily to the eldest son, but to the member of the royal family who was best qualified to maintain the sacred obligations of kingship. This qualification was determined not by political maneuvering, but by spiritual testing, with the Druids and the representatives of the Tuatha de Danann playing key roles in identifying the rightful Airt. The legacy of Éremon's kingship was the demonstration that mortal rule could be as sacred and effective as divine rule had been, provided that the mortal rulers remained connected to the spiritual sources of their authority. His example inspired the great line of Irish kings who followed, each of whom sought to embody in their own way the principles of justice, wisdom, and spiritual connection that he had established. The transformation from divine to mortal rule in Ireland was complete, but it was not a diminishment, but a deepening of the spiritual dimensions of kingship. The mortal kings who followed Éremon would face challenges that required them to draw upon both human wisdom and divine inspiration, creating a form of rule that was uniquely suited to the needs of a people who lived at the intersection of the material and spiritual worlds, the ancient pathways that connected Hillfort to Sacred Grove, where druids walked in procession carrying torches that flickered like fallen stars against the darkness of primeval forests. In the wake of the Tuatha, the Danann's retreat into the Otherworld, the sons of Esbane stood upon the shores of Ireland as the first mortal kings of the island. The eldest among them, Éber Finn, gazed across the rolling green hills that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, while his brother Éremon looked northward to where mist clung to ancient mountains, like memories refusing to fade. The division of Ireland between these two brothers would echo through centuries, a pattern of unity and division that would define the character of Irish kingship for generations to come. Éber Finn claimed the southern half of Ireland, establishing his seat where the River Lugh wound through fertile valleys that seemed to pulse with the very heartbeat of the land. His kingdom encompassed the gentle slopes of Munster, where cattle grazed in meadows so green they appeared to have been painted by the hands of gods. The southern king ruled with the wisdom of one who understood that true power flowed not from the sword alone, but from the deep connection between ruler and the sacred soil beneath his feet. Meanwhile, Éremon took dominion over the northern territories, where the landscape grew wilder and more mysterious, where ancient stones stood in circles that older peoples had raised to mark the passage of seasons and the turning of cosmic wheels. His kingdom stretched from the windswept coasts of Ulster to the mystical heart of Connaught, where lakes reflected not just the sky above, but seemed to mirror the very soul of Ireland itself. For a time, the brothers ruled in harmony their kingdoms, complementing each other like two halves of a perfectly balanced whole. Trade flowed between north and south along ancient roads that the Tuatha the Danann had blessed with safe passage. Cattle and grain moved southward, while crafted goods and wisdom travelled north, creating a web of connection that strengthened both realms. The people prospered under this dual kingship, building settlements that grew into towns, clearing forests, to create fields where golden grain would wave in summer breezes. But the peace was not destined to endure. As seasons turned and years accumulated like leaves falling in autumn, tensions began to surface between the brothers. The division of Ireland had been made in haste, drawn by lines that satisfied neither king completely. Border disputes arose over fertile river valleys that both kingdoms claimed, over mountain passes that controlled trade routes, over sacred sites where the old gods had walked and where both brothers wished to build their temples. The conflict that erupted between Éber Finn and Éremon was not merely a struggle for territory, but a deeper contest over the very nature of kingship itself. Éber Finn believed that a king should rule through consensus and wisdom, gathering the chiefs of his Tuatha around him to make decisions that would benefit all. His courts were places of music and poetry, where bards sang of heroes and druids, interpreted the will of the gods through careful observation of natural signs. Éremon, however, saw kingship as a sacred trust that required swift decision and unwavering authority. His rule was more centralized, more direct, reflecting perhaps the harsher landscape of his northern territories where survival often depended on quick action and unified command. His warriors were disciplined and loyal, bound to him by oaths that were considered as sacred as the bonds between druids and their gods. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Cesair, fought on a plain where wildflowers bloomed in such profusion that the battlefield seemed carpeted with nature's own tapestry. The two armies met at dawn, when mist still clung to the grass and the air carried the scent of dew and expectation. The battle was fierce but brief, a clash of brothers whose love for each other was exceeded only by their determination to rule all of Ireland. Éber fell in that battle, his blood seeping into the earth he had loved so deeply, his final breath carrying prayers for the unity of the land that would now be divided no more. Éremon stood over his brother's body and wept, understanding too late that victory and war could never heal the wounds that such conflicts carved into the heart of kingship itself. With his brother's death, Éremon became the first High King of all Ireland, a title that would carry both immense honour and terrible burden. He established his primary seat at Tara, on a hill that commanded views across the central plain and seemed to reach toward the very heavens themselves. Here, where the Tuatha de Danann had once held court, Éremon built a great hall where the kings of all the Irish kingdoms would come to acknowledge his sovereignty. But the kingship of Éremon was marked by the shadow of his brother's death, a grief that coloured every decision and every celebration. The High King instituted the great festivals that would unite the tribes when the veil between worlds grew thin and Lugh, when the harvest was celebrated with games and competitions that brought warriors and craftsmen together in peaceful rivalry. Yet even in these moments of joy, the memory of Éber lingered like a song half remembered, beautiful but tinged with sorrow. The reign of Éremon established patterns that would define Irish kingship for centuries to come. The concept of the High King, or Ardru, became central to Irish political structure, though it would prove to be as much a source of conflict as unity. Future kings would claim the title through conquest, through marriage alliances, through demonstrations of wisdom or strength, but always with the understanding that the High Kingship was both a sacred trust and a political necessity. Under Éremon rule, Ireland began to develop the complex social structures that would characterize Gaelic society. The Tuatha, or tribe, became the basic unit of political organization, each governed by its own king, but all acknowledging the authority of the High King in matters that affected the entire island. The Brehon laws, that intricate legal code that governed everything from property rights to marriage contracts, began to take shape during this period, developed by generations of lawyers and judges who sought to create justice through careful precedent and reasoned argument. The Druids, too, found their role evolving under the new order. No longer the primary political authorities they had been under the Tuatha de Danann, they became advisors and interpreters, keepers of wisdom and tradition, who could counsel kings but could not rule directly. Their schools became centers of learning where young nobles came to study not just the mysteries of religion and magic, but also history, law, poetry, and the arts of leadership. The line of Éremon produced kings whose names would echo through the ages, each adding their own. Chapter 2, the Great Saga of Irish Sovereignty. These were the kings of the Silver Branch, so called because they carried scepters crafted from silver that had been blessed by the Druids and inscribed with ogham symbols that told the story of their lineage and their sacred duties. Among the first of these great kings was Iriel Fade, whose name meant Iriel, the prophet, for he possessed the gift of seeing into the future and understanding the patterns that connected present actions to their distant consequences. His reign was marked by the establishment of the great roads that connected Ireland's major settlements, roads that were built not merely for commerce and warfare, but as spiritual pathways that united the sacred geography of the island. Fade understood that a king's greatest power lay not in his ability to command armies, but in his capacity to create connections between tribe and tribe, between past and future, between the world of humans and the other world of gods and spirits. His court at Terra became a center of learning where scholars from across the Celtic world came to study the ancient wisdom that Ireland had preserved through the ages. The king's most famous achievement was the creation of the Circuit of Ireland, a ritual journey that each High King was expected to undertake once in his reign. This circuit took the king to every corner of the island, from the windswept cliffs of the west to the gentle hills of the east, from the mysterious north to the fertile south. At each stop, the king would perform ceremonies that renewed the bonds between ruler and land, between human society and the natural world. During these journeys, Iriel Fade would sit in judgment at local assemblies, hearing disputes that could not be resolved by local kings and ensuring that justice flowed evenly across all territories. He would also participate in the seasonal festivals that marked the turning of the year, lending his royal presence to celebrations that honored the gods and goddesses who continued to watch over Ireland from their homes in the Otherworld. Reign of Iriel Fade was followed by that of his son, Ethriel, whose kingship was marked by the first great invasion that Ireland would face since the coming of the Milesians. From across the sea came warriors called the Fomorians, ancient enemies of the Tuatha, the Danann, who had been thought defeated in the mists of prehistory. These were beings of chaos and darkness, drawn by the growing prosperity of Ireland and determined to claim it for themselves. The war against the Fomorians tested every aspect of Irish society that the early kings had built. The Tuatha were forced to work together as never before, setting aside local disputes to face a common enemy. The Druids called upon all their ancient knowledge, seeking aid from the Tuatha Danann, who still dwelt in the Esti Mounds and who remembered their own conflicts with the Fomorians from ages past. King Ithriel proved himself a worthy successor to his father, leading the united Irish forces with courage and wisdom. The final battle was fought at Mag Tuired, the same plain where the Tuatha de Danann had once faced the Fomorians in their own legendary conflict. The battle raged for 3 days and 3 nights, with the very elements seeming to take part in the conflict as storms swept across the battlefield, and the earth itself groaned under the weight of cosmic struggle. Victory came not through strength of arms alone, but through the unity of purpose that Ithriel had forged among the Irish kingdoms. The Fomorians were driven back into the sea. Their threat ended not just by military defeat, but by the demonstration that Ireland under the High Kings was no longer a collection of separate tribes, but a single people capable of defending their homeland against any threat. The aftermath of the Fomorian War saw the establishment of new traditions that would define Irish kingship for centuries. The High King's authority was no longer merely ceremonial, but had been proven in the crucible of war. A new class of professional warriors emerged, men who served not just their local kings but the High King himself, forming the basis of what would become the famous Fianna Island's legendary warrior bands. The next great king of this dynasty was Conmail, whose reign was marked not by war but by the flowering of Irish culture and learning. Understanding that a kingdom's true strength lay not in its weapons but in its wisdom, Conmail established the great schools that would make Ireland famous throughout the Celtic world as an island of saints and scholars. Under Conmail's patronage, the Druids began to commit their oral traditions to writing, creating the first books that would preserve Irish lore, history, and mythology for future generations. The Ogham script which had been used primarily for marking stones and monuments, was expanded and refined to create a complete writing system that could capture the nuances of Gaelic language and thought. The king's court became a center of artistic achievement where craftsmen pushed the boundaries of their skills to create works of beauty that would endure for centuries. The famous Arda chalice, with its intricate silverwork and mysterious symbols, was created during this period, as were the great torques and brooches that adorned the nobility and marked their status in society. Music and poetry flourished under Conmail's rule, with bards holding positions of honor second only to the Druids themselves. The great cycles of Irish mythology, the stories of Tuatha and the Táin, the adventures of Fionn mac Cumhaill, and the Fianna began to take their final form during this period, shaped by generations of storytellers who understood that these tales were not merely entertainment but repositories of wisdom and cultural memory. The reign of Conmail established Ireland's reputation as a center of learning that would attract students from across Europe. The monasteries that would later make Ireland famous as the land of saints and scholars built upon foundations laid during this period, when the king's patronage created an atmosphere where learning and spiritual inquiry could flourish together. The greatest of the early Milesian kings was Ugaine, whose name meant Ugaine the Great, and whose reign marked the height of early Irish power and influence. He came to the throne at a time when Ireland had achieved internal unity and was ready to look beyond its shores, to claim its place among the great powers of the Celtic world. Ugaine's vision extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of Irish kingship. He saw Ireland not as an isolated island, but as the potential center of a great Celtic empire that could unite all the children of the gods under a single crown. His ambitions were matched by his abilities, for he possessed not only the warrior's courage and the ruler's wisdom, but also the diplomat's skill and the prophet's vision. The king's first great achievement was the complete unification of Ireland. Under his direct rule, previous high kings had been content to rule through the consent of the provincial kings, but Ugaine understood that true power required more direct control. He established a system of governors who answered directly to him, ensuring that royal authority reached into every corner of the island. This centralization was not achieved through force alone, but through a careful combination of military strength, political skill, and economic incentive. Ugaine created a system of roads and communications that linked all parts of Ireland more closely than ever before. Trade flourished under his rule, with Irish goods reaching markets in Britain, Gaul, and even distant Mediterranean ports. The wealth that flowed into Ireland during this period funded the greatest building projects in the island's history. The royal complex at Tara was expanded and beautified, becoming a wonder that drew visitors from across the Celtic world. Great stone circles were erected to mark the boundaries of the kingdom and to serve as centers for the festivals that celebrated the unity of the Irish people. But Ugaine's greatest achievement was his expansion beyond Ireland's shores. Understanding that the sea was not a barrier but a highway, he began to build a fleet that would carry Irish power to distant lands. His ships, carved with the symbols of Irish kingship and blessed by the Druids, sailed first to the Isle of Man, then to the Scottish Islands, and finally to the mainland of Britain itself. The conquest of these lands was not merely military but cultural and spiritual. Ugaine understood that lasting conquest required not just the defeat of enemies, but their transformation into allies and eventually into fellow Irishmen. He established colonies in the conquered territories, sending Irish families to settle. the land and bringing the children of conquered chiefs to Ireland to be educated in Irish ways. The king's most famous expedition was his campaign in Gaul, where he allied with Celtic tribes that were facing pressure from Germanic peoples moving west. The Irish warriors who fought in these distant lands carried with them not just weapons, but the culture and wisdom of their homeland, establishing Ireland's reputation as a centre of Celtic civilization. These foreign adventures brought great wealth to Ireland, but they also brought new challenges. The administration of a far-flung empire required new forms of organization and communication. Ugaine established the first royal bureaucracy, with scribes and administrators who could manage the complex task of governing territories. Separated by hundreds of miles of sea, the king's court became cosmopolitan, welcoming ambassadors and traders from across the known world. Greek merchants brought luxury goods from the Mediterranean, while Germanic warriors came to serve in the Irish armies. This cultural mixing enriched Irish society, but also created new tensions as traditional ways were challenged by foreign influences. Ugaine Móra's reign was marked by the establishment of the great festivals that would unite his far-flung empire. The Feast of Terror, held each year at Swen, became the most important political event in the Celtic world, drawing kings and nobles from across the Irish sphere of influence. These gatherings were not merely social occasions, but opportunities for the renewal of oaths, the settlement of disputes, and the celebration of shared identity. The king's death marked the end of an era, for no subsequent ruler would match his achievements or his vision. He had ruled for 40 years, longer than any previous Irish king, and had expanded Irish power to its greatest extent. But his greatest legacy was not territorial, but cultural: the establishment of Ireland as the acknowledged centre of Celtic civilization, the island from which law and learning flowed to all corners of the Celtic world. The funeral of Ugaine Mara was the greatest ceremony in Irish history up to that time. His body was carried in procession around the entire circuit of Ireland, allowing all his subjects to pay their respects to the king who had made their island the centre of a great empire. He was buried at Tara with treasures from across his dominions, his grave becoming a place of pilgrimage for centuries to come. But the great king's death also marked the beginning of a new period of conflict, for his empire was too vast and too diverse to be held together by his successors. The various kingdoms that had been united under his rule began to assert their independence, and the unity that had been Ireland's greatest strength began to fracture along the lines of old tribal loyalties and new territorial ambitions. The death of Ugaine Mara was followed by the most dramatic division in Irish history, as his empire was split among his many sons according to the ancient laws of inheritance. This division, known as the Partition of Ugaine, would shape the political landscape of Ireland for centuries to come and establish the pattern of provincial kingship that would define Irish politics until the coming of the Normans. The kingdom was divided into 25 parts, each given to one of Ugaine's sons, but the most significant division was between the two eldest, Lugh and Cobthach Ceol. Lugh received the northern half of Ireland, including the sacred seat of Tara, while Cobthach was given the southern territories. This division recreated the ancient pattern established by Éremon and Éber, but with a crucial difference: neither brother acknowledged the other's supremacy. Lugh, whose name meant Lugh the Wise, attempted to maintain the unity of his father's empire through diplomacy and alliance. He understood that the strength of Ugaine's kingdom had come not from central control, but from the willing cooperation of diverse peoples, united by shared culture and common purpose. His court at Terra became a center of learning and lawmaking, where the great legal codes were refined and expanded to govern the complex relationships between the various kingdoms. The northern king's greatest achievement was the establishment of the great assembly known as the Fes Temrach, a gathering held every 3 years at Terra where all the kings of Ireland would come together to renew their oaths of allegiance and to settle disputes that could not be resolved at the local level. This assembly became the closest thing to a parliament that early Ireland would know, a forum where the voice of law could be heard above the clash of arms. Cobh Thatch Caol, whose name meant Cobthog the Slender, took a different approach to the challenge of ruling his inheritance. A skilled warrior and cunning politician, he understood that power in the post-Ugaine world would flow not to the most legitimate ruler but to the most effective one. He began systematically to eliminate or subordinate his brothers, using a combination of military force, political intrigue, and strategic marriages to build a power base that could challenge Lugh's position. The conflict between the brothers was not merely personal but represented 2 different visions of Irish kingship. Lugh believed in the traditional model of the High King as first among equals, a ruler who governed through consent and consensus. Cobthog, however, saw the need for a more centralized and authoritarian form of kingship, one that could respond quickly to threats and opportunities in an increasingly complex world. The war between the brothers lasted for 7 years, a conflict that devastated much of Ireland and marked the end of the great unity that Ugaine had created. The decisive battle was fought at Mag Muirtham, where Cobthog's disciplined forces defeated Lugh's more numerous but less unified army. Lugh himself was killed in the battle, and with his death, the dream of a unified Irish empire died as well. Cobthog's victory established him as High King of all Ireland, but it was a hollow triumph. The kingdom he inherited was exhausted by war and fragmented by division. Many of the territories that had been part of Ugaine's empire had declared their independence during the conflict, and the complex network of alliances and obligations that had held the empire together had been shattered beyond repair. The new High King's reign was marked by constant warfare as he attempted to restore the unity of his father's empire. He fought campaigns in Britain and Gaul, trying to reassert Irish authority over territories that had been lost during the Civil War. But these foreign adventures only weakened Ireland further, draining the island's resources and leaving it vulnerable to new threats. The greatest of these threats came from an unexpected source: the rise of powerful provincial kings who had used the chaos of the Civil War to establish their own independent domains. In Ulster, the descendants of the ancient heroes were building a kingdom that would challenge the authority of Terra itself. In Connaught, the mysterious people known as the Firbolg were establishing a realm that drew its power from the ancient sacred sites of Western Ireland. Most significantly, in Munster, the kingdom of Éber Finn's descendants was experiencing a renaissance. Under a dynasty of warrior kings who claimed to be the true inheritors of Milesian authority, these southern kings built great fortresses at Cashel and other strategic locations, creating a power base that could rival anything that Terra could muster. The rise of these provincial powers marked the beginning of a new phase in Irish history, one in which the High Kingship became less a position of absolute authority and more a prize to be contested among competing dynasties. The concept of the High King remained important, but it was now balanced by the reality of powerful provincial rulers who could challenge royal authority, and who often commanded greater resources than the High King himself. This period also saw the emergence of the great warrior bands that would become legendary in Irish history. The Fianna, originally royal guards in the service of the High King, began to operate as semi-independent military forces, owing loyalty to their own commanders. As much as to any political authority, these warriors developed their own code of honor and their own traditions, creating a military culture that would influence Irish society for centuries. The fragmentation of royal authority also led to the rise of the Druids as independent political actors. No longer dependent on royal patronage alone, the Druids began to play different kingdoms against each other, offering their services to whoever would best serve their interests. This gave them greater influence in some ways, but it also made them more vulnerable to political changes and less able to maintain their traditional role as the keepers of Irish cultural unity. The reign of Cobthach Ceol ended in violence, as had so many of the kingships of this troubled period. He was killed in battle against a coalition of provincial kings who had united against his attempts to restore central authority. His death marked the end of the last serious attempt to recreate the empire of Ugaine, Mora, and the beginning of a new era in which Ireland would be ruled by a complex balance of competing powers rather than a single, dominant authority. The period following Cobthach's death was marked by rapid changes in the succession to the High Kingship. Kings rose and fell with bewildering frequency, each attempting to establish their authority over the provincial rulers, and each ultimately failing to create lasting unity. The Great Hall at Tara, which had once been the center of a mighty empire, became a symbol of faded glory, its walls echoing with the memories of greater days. Yet this period of apparent chaos was also one of cultural creativity and political innovation. The breakdown of central authority forced the Irish to develop new forms of organization and cooperation. The Brehon laws became more sophisticated and comprehensive, providing a legal framework that could function even in the absence of strong central government. The great cycles of Irish mythology were refined and expanded during this period, as bards and storytellers created narratives that could unite the Irish people even when their rulers could not. The art and craftsmanship of this period also reached new heights, as wealthy provincial rulers competed to patronize the greatest artists and craftsmen. The famous illuminated manuscripts that would later make Irish art famous throughout Europe had their origins in this period, when the fragmentation of political authority created multiple centers of artistic innovation and achievement. Most importantly, this period saw the emergence of the concept of Irish identity that would transcend political boundaries. Even as the kingdoms fought each other for supremacy, they remained united by shared language, shared laws, and shared cultural traditions. The idea of Ireland as a single nation, if not a single kingdom, began to take shape during this period, creating a foundation for future unity that would survive even the most devastating political upheavals. As the generations passed and the memory of Ugaine Mora's empire faded into legend, the Irish began to develop a new understanding of their place in the world. They were no longer the rulers of a great empire, but the guardians of an ancient culture, the keepers of wisdom and tradition that had been passed down from the gods themselves. This understanding would shape Irish identity for centuries to come, creating a sense of purpose and mission that would sustain the Irish people through all the challenges and changes that lay ahead. The mists of time grew thicker as the centuries rolled forward, and with them came the greatest of all Ireland's heroic ages. The Ulster cycle, that magnificent tapestry of valour and tragedy, began to unfold in the Northern Kingdom, where the Red Branch Knights would write their names in blood and glory upon the pages of eternal memory. in the halls of Ugaine Marcher, the royal seat of Ulster, there ruled a king whose name would echo through the ages like thunder across the hills. Conqueror Mac Nessa, son of the druidess Nessa, came to power through wisdom and cunning, his reign marking the beginning of an era when heroes walked the earth like gods among mortals. The young conqueror had not sought the throne through conquest or birthright alone. His mother Nessa had negotiated with Fergus Mac Roich, the king of Ulster, securing a promise that her son would rule for 1 year while Fergus took her as his bride. Yet, when that year ended, the nobles of Ulster, having witnessed Conqueror's just rule and generous spirit, refused to see him step down. Thus began a reign that would span decades and give birth to the greatest heroes Ireland had ever known. The Red Branch, that legendary brotherhood of warriors, gathered around their king like stars around the moon. Each knight was a master of arms, a poet of battle, a man whose deeds would be sung by bards for generations uncounted. They dwelt in the house of the Red Branch, a great hall where weapons hung like jewels upon the walls, and where the greatest warriors of the age would feast and tell tales of their exploits. Among these mighty men, one name rose above all others, spoken in whispers of awe and wonder: Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster, whose birth had been foretold by druids and whose death would shake the very foundations of the world. Born as Esartanta to Daichtine, sister of King Conqueror, the boy who would become Ireland's greatest hero showed his extraordinary nature from his earliest days. The tale of how Sartana earned his legendary name has been told 1,000 times, yet it never loses its power to stir the heart. When the boy was but 7 years old, he journeyed to the court of Cullen the smith, where a great feast was being held. Arriving late, he found the gates barred and the fierce hound of Cullen loose. In the courtyard, a beast so terrible that it could slay 100 men. Yet young Satana showed no fear. When the hound charged, its jaws agape and eyes blazing with murderous intent, the boy caught his hurling ball and drove it down the beast's throat with such force that it shattered the creature's skull. Cullen wept for his faithful guardian, and in that moment of sorrow, the boy made a vow that would change his destiny forever. "I will be your hound," Satana declared, "until you can find another to match the one I have slain." And so he became Cuchulainn, the Hound of Cullen, though the druid Cathbad prophesied that his name would be spoken with reverence long after the smith's name was forgotten. The transformation of boy to hero was swift and wondrous. Under the tutelage of the warriors of Ulster, Cuchulainn mastered every weapon known to man. He learned the arts of war from Fergus Mac Roich, who had become his foster father after yielding the throne to Conquest. The great warrior taught him the use of sword and spear, the tactics of battle, and the code of honor that bound the Red Branch Knights. But it was to the warrior woman Scathach, in her fortress on the Isle of Skye, that Cuchulainn journeyed, to learn the most fearsome of all martial arts. There, in that shadowy realm where the mortal world touched the realm of spirits, he mastered the Gay Bolga, the terrible spear that could pierce any armor and strike down any foe. Scathach taught him the warp spasm, that terrifying battle frenzy that would transform him from man to something beyond mortal comprehension. The warp spasm was both gift and curse, for when it seized him, Tuired became a creature of such terrible aspect that even his closest friends dared not approach. His hair stood on end like spears, his eyes blazed with inner fire, and his very presence on the battlefield could turn the tide of any conflict. Yet this power came with a price, for the hero who possessed it was marked by fate for a glorious but brief life in the court of Conquest. Other heroes too began to make their mark upon the world. Conel Cernac, the victorious, earned his name through countless battles where his skill with weapons proved unmatched. He was the avenger of wrongs, the shield of the innocent, and the sword of justice for the kingdom of Ulster. His vow to avenge the death of any Red Branch knight would one day lead him to fulfill the most sacred of oaths. Fergus mac Roich, though he had yielded the throne, remained the strongest of all the Red Branch, capable of felling 100 men with his great sword. His wisdom in council was matched only by his prowess in battle, and his loyalty to Ulster ran deeper than the roots of the ancient oaks. Yet fate would test even this mighty hero, forcing him to choose between loyalty to his king and his own sense of justice. The Druid Cathbed, whose prophecies guided the actions of kings and heroes alike, dwelt in the sacred groves near Emain Marcha. His knowledge of the future was both blessing and burden, for he could see the threads of fate weaving together to create tapestries of triumph and tragedy. It was Cathbad who foretold that Sir Chulan would have a choice between a long, peaceful life and a short life filled with eternal glory. The hero chose glory, as heroes always do, in the court of Conquest, to dwelt the most beautiful woman in all Ireland, whose beauty would prove more dangerous than any weapon forged by mortal hands. Deirdre of the Sorrows, daughter of the storyteller Fedlamid, was born under a prophecy that foretold she would bring ruin to the kingdom of Ulster. The Druids counselled that she should be slain as an infant, but Conquest, moved by her beauty, even as a child, decreed that she should be raised in secret and become his bride when she came of age, hidden away in a remote dwelling with only her nurse for company. Deirdre grew to womanhood knowing nothing of the world beyond her prison. Yet beauty such as hers could not remain hidden forever, and when she came to know of her intended fate, she chose instead to flee with Nawaz, son of Uisnech, the most handsome of all the Red Branch knights. With Nawaz and his brothers Arden and Aenel, Deirdre fled to Alba, where they lived in exile for 7 years. Their love became the stuff of legend, pure and true despite the doom that hung over them like a shadow. Yet Conquest's heart burned with jealousy and rage, and he would not rest until he had reclaimed what he considered his own. The king's invitation for the sons of Uisnech to return to Ulster came cloaked in promises of forgiveness and guarantees of safe passage. Fergus mac Roich, that most honourable of men, was sent to escort them home, his word given as surety for their safety. Yet treachery waited in the halls of Emain Macha, and when the exiles returned, they found not welcome but betrayal. Through cunning and deceit, Conquest separated Fergus from his charges, sending him away on a false errand while the sons of Uisnech entered the royal court alone. There, surrounded by warriors loyal to the king, Nawaz and his brothers were slain despite their prowess in battle. Deirdre, her heart broken by the sight of her beloved's death, took her own life rather than submit to the king who had destroyed her happiness. The deaths of the sons of Uisnech and Deirdre marked the beginning of Ulster's decline, for the deed stained the honour of the Red Branch and drove some of its greatest heroes into exile. Fergus mac Roich, his word of safe passage broken and his honour tarnished, departed Ulster forever, taking with him 3,000 warriors to serve the enemies of Conquest. The kingdom that had once been united under one great king now faced the first cracks in its foundation. Yet even as these shadows gathered, the greatest tale of the Ulster cycle was yet to unfold. In the court of Connaught, Queen Meb, whose ambition burned as bright as her beauty, began to plot against Ulster. She had heard tales of the great brown bull of Cooley, the Don Calange, whose strength and majesty surpassed even her own prized bull, the Finban. This slight to her pride would not stand, and she began to gather an army to take by force what she could not obtain through negotiation. The Tain Borcalange, the cattle raid of Cooley, would prove to be the greatest conflict of the heroic age, a war that would test the courage of heroes and the loyalty of kingdoms. For this was no mere raid for cattle, but a clash between the forces of Connaught and Ulster that would determine the fate of all Ireland. Queen Meb assembled an army, unlike any seen before in Ireland. From every corner of Connaught came warriors eager to follow their queen to glory. From Munster came the warriors of Leinster, drawn by promises of gold and cattle. From overseas came champions and mercenaries, each seeking to prove their worth in the greatest conflict of the age. But it was not merely the size of Meb's army that made it formidable. Among her champions rode Fergus mac Roich, the exiled former king of Ulster, whose knowledge of his homeland's defences and whose prowess in battle made him invaluable to the Queen's cause. With him came other exiles from Ulster, men whose loyalty to their former king had been broken by the treachery they had witnessed. The army of Connaught was a sight to behold as it marched toward Ulster. Thousands of warriors moved like a sea, of bronze and iron, their spears glinting in the sunlight, their shields bearing the emblems of a dozen kingdoms. At their head rode Queen Meb herself, her red hair streaming in the wind, her presence inspiring both fear and admiration in those who beheld her. Yet, as this mighty host approached the borders of Ulster, they encountered an obstacle that no army, however great, could overcome through force of arms alone. The men of Ulster lay helpless under the curse of Marcha, afflicted with the pains of childbirth that left them unable to bear weapons or defend their homeland. This ancient curse, laid upon the Ulstermen by the goddess Marcha when she was wronged by King Conqueror's ancestors, struck at the most crucial moment, leaving the kingdom defenceless. All the warriors of Ulster lay groaning in their beds, seized by pangs that no man should have to endure. Conqueror himself was rendered helpless, as were all the mighty champions of the Red Branch. Only the young men who had not yet reached warrior age, the old men who had passed beyond it, and the women of Ulster remained free from the curse's power in this darkest hour. When the very existence of Ulster hung in the balance, one figure emerged from the shadows of destiny. Tuatha, the Hound of Ulster, alone among the warriors of his kingdom, remained unaffected by the curse. Some say it was because of his divine parentage, for his true father was Lugh of the Long Arm, the god of skill and light. Others claim it was because his youth protected him from the full force of Matcha's wrath. Whatever the reason, Tuatha stood alone against the army of Connaught, one man against thousands, the sole defender of a kingdom that had raised him and made him what he was. The odds were impossible, the task hopeless, yet the hero did not hesitate. He had been born for this moment, trained for this trial, and he would meet it with the courage that had made him the greatest warrior in Ireland. The defence of Ulster began not with a great battle, but with a single act of defiance. Tuatha cut down a great tree and used it to block the path of Meb's army at the ford of Athgabla. Upon the tree he carved his name in Ogham script, challenging any warrior who dared to single combat. This was the beginning of the Tain, the great cattle raid that would become the most famous story in all Irish literature. For months, Tuatha held the army of Connaught at bay through single combat, accepting the challenge of champion after champion who came forward to face him. Each morning brought a new warrior eager to win glory by defeating the Hound of Ulster, and each evening saw another hero carried away on his shield. The young champion's prowess seemed inexhaustible, his courage unshakable, his determination absolute. Yet even the greatest of heroes must face moments of doubt and despair. Tuatha fought not just against the warriors of Connaught, but against time itself, for with each passing day the curse upon Ulster grew stronger, and the hope of relief grew dimmer. His wounds accumulated, his strength began to flag, and still the enemy host stretched before him like an endless sea. In these dark moments, aid came from unexpected sources. The Morrigan, the goddess of war and fate, appeared to him in various forms. Sometimes as a young woman offering love, sometimes as a hag prophesying doom, sometimes as a raven watching from the trees. Her messages were cryptic, her motives unclear, but her presence reminded Tuatha that he fought, not just for Ulster, but for the very balance of fate itself. His father Lugh, the god of light and skill, also came to his aid, healing his wounds, and filling him with divine strength for the battles ahead, in a magical sleep that lasted 3 days and nights. Tuatha's injuries were healed, and he awoke refreshed and ready to continue his impossible task. But it was not divine aid alone that sustained the young hero. The love of Éber, his wife, reached out to him across the miles, strengthening his heart when his body grew weak. The memory of his training with Celtic guided his hand when skill alone was not enough. The honor of the Red Branch, tarnished though it was by recent betrayals, still burned bright in his breast. The single combats that marked the Táin were not merely contests of strength and skill, but tests of character and honor. Each warrior who faced Tuatha brought his own story, his own reasons for fighting, his own concept of what it meant to be a hero. Some sought glory, others sought revenge, still others fought simply because their queen commanded it. Among the champions who fell to Tuatha's prowess was Lch Macmophmis, a warrior whose reputation had spread throughout Ireland. There, the battle lasted from dawn to dusk, neither able to gain a decisive advantage until finally Tuatha's gay Bolga found its mark. The death of such a renowned champion sent shockwaves through the army of Connaught, for if Lch could not defeat the Hound of Ulster, who could? Yet for every champion who fell, 10 more seemed to take his place. The army of Connaught was like a hydra, growing new heads wherever one was cut off. Queen Meb, frustrated by the delays but impressed by the young hero's courage, began to offer increasing rewards for his defeat. Gold, cattle, land, even her own daughters, hand in marriage all, were promised to the warrior who could bring her the head of Cesair. As the siege continued, strange and terrible events began to unfold. The very landscape seemed to respond to the epic nature of the conflict. Rivers ran red with blood, the earth trembled beneath the feet of armies, and the birds of the air gathered in vast flocks to feast upon the fallen. The Táin was becoming something more than a war. It was a collision of forces that would reshape the very fabric of Ireland. In the camp of Connaught, tensions began to rise as the promised quick victory turned into a prolonged siege. Warriors from different kingdoms began to quarrel among themselves, and Queen Meb found it increasingly difficult to maintain unity among her diverse forces. The presence of Fergus mac Roich, the exiled former king of Ulster, created particular complications, for his knowledge of the enemy was balanced by his obvious reluctance to see his former kingdom destroyed. The relationship between Meb and Fergus was complex, coloured by political necessity, personal attraction, and the shadows of past betrayals. Fergus had come to Connaught, seeking revenge against Conquest, but as the war progressed, he found himself caught between his desire for vengeance and his lingering love for Ulster. This internal conflict would prove crucial in the climactic moments of the Táin. Meanwhile, in Ulster, the cursed warriors began to stir. The power of Match's curse was not infinite, and as the seasons turned, some of the younger warriors began to recover. Hope flickered in the hearts of the Ulstermen as they realized that their champion still lived, still fought, still held the line against impossible odds. The first to recover was Tuatha's own charioteer, Lugh Riangobra, whose loyalty to his master had never wavered. With Lugh came the hero's magical chariot and his great horses, the grey of Marcher and the black of Sangliu, whose supernatural speed and strength had carried their master through countless battles. The reunion of hero and charioteer marked a turning point in the war. For now, Tuatha could truly unleash the full extent of his powers. The battles that followed were unlike anything seen before in Ireland. Tuatha in his chariot was a force of nature, his warp spasm transforming him into something beyond mortal comprehension. His very presence on the battlefield could turn seasoned warriors to flight, and his war cry could be heard for miles across the countryside. Yet, even as his power reached its peak, the seeds of tragedy were being sown. The Táin was not merely a test of strength, but a working out of fate, and fate had decreed that this greatest of heroes must face his greatest trial. The arrival of Fir Diad, Tuatha's foster brother and closest friend, in the ranks of Connaught's army, would provide that trial. Fir Diad mac Dumain was the only warrior in Ireland who could match Tuatha in skill and courage. They had trained together under Cesair, learned the same deadly arts, sworn oaths of brotherhood that should have bound them for life. Yet now they stood on opposite sides of a war that would allow for no mercy, no half measures, no compromise. The combat between Tuatha and Fir Diad was not just a battle between warriors, but a tragedy of friendship, destroyed by the demands of honor and duty. For 3 days they fought at the ford of Athfeadia, each day bringing new weapons to bear, each night sharing memories of their youth and their training together. The contest was so evenly matched that neither could gain a decisive advantage, and both warriors were pushed to the very limits of their endurance. On the 4th day, as the sun reached its zenith, Tuatha was finally forced to use the Gay Boga, the terrible spear that Cesair had taught him, as a last resort. The weapon found its mark, and Fir Diad fell, his life ebbing away in the shallow waters of the ford. The grief of Tuatha at the death of his dearest friend was so great that his lament was said to move even the stones to tears. The death of Fir Diad marked the beginning of the end for Queen Meb's invasion. The psychological impact of seeing their greatest champion defeated by the Hound of Ulster was devastating to the morale of the Connaught army. More practically, the curse upon Ulster was finally beginning to lift, and the warriors of the Red Branch were stirring from their supernatural slumber. King Conqueror himself was among the first to recover, his strength returning like a tide that had turned. With him came the other champions of Ulster Conal, Cernac, Dubthach, the Beetle-tongued, and all the mighty warriors who had made the Red Branch the most feared military force in Ireland. The men of Ulster were awakening, and their anger at the invasion of their homeland burned, like a flame that would consume everything in its path. The final battle of the Táin was fought at Druimturb, where the assembled might of Ulster met the army of Connaught in a conflict that would determine the fate of both kingdoms. The battle was fierce beyond description, with heroes falling like wheat before the scythe, and the very air filled with the clash of weapons and the cries of the wounded and dying. In the midst of this chaos, Queen Meb achieved her original objective, for her warriors had succeeded in driving the great brown bull of Cooley back to Connaught. Yet this victory proved hollow, for when the Don Killange met the Finbanech, Meb's prized white bull, the two beasts fought with such fury that both were destroyed. The cause of the Great War was thus reduced to nothing, leaving only the memory of the heroes who had died in its pursuit. The army of Connaught, Beaten, but not destroyed, began its long retreat to the west. Queen Meb, her ambitions thwarted but her pride intact, withdrew with as much dignity as she could muster. The Táin was over, but its consequences would reverberate through Irish history for generations to come. For Ulster, the victory was complete. But costly. The kingdom had been saved, but the flower of its youth had been spent in the struggle. Many of the greatest warriors of the Red Branch had fallen, and those who survived bore scars that would never fully heal. The unity that had once made Ulster invincible had been fractured by the betrayals that preceded the war, and though the kingdom endured, it would never again achieve the glory of its heroic age. Tuatha emerged from the Táin as the greatest hero in Irish legend, his deeds surpassing even those of his predecessors. Yet the burden of his fame was heavy, and the knowledge that his own fate was sealed weighed upon him like a stone. The prophecy that had marked his youth a choice between long life and eternal glory had been fulfilled, but at a cost that even he had not fully comprehended. The years that followed the Táin were marked by a gradual decline in the fortunes of Ulster. The curse of Marcha had been lifted, but other curses, born of human treachery and divine displeasure, began to take their toll. The betrayal of the sons of Uisnech had stained the honour of the kingdom, and the gods themselves seemed to have turned their faces away from Conquest and his court. King Cesair, though victorious in war, found his later years haunted by the consequences of his earlier actions. The death of Deirdre and the sons of Uisnech had driven away some of his greatest champions, and the kingdom that had once been united under his rule now faced internal strife and external threats. The king who had once been hailed as the greatest ruler in Ireland found himself increasingly isolated, his court a shadow of its former glory. Yet even in decline, the court of Ulster continued to produce heroes whose deeds would be remembered long after their deaths. The sons of Fergus mac Roich, despite their father's exile, remained loyal to Ulster and proved themselves worthy inheritors of the Red Branch tradition. New champions arose to take the places of those who had fallen, and the martial spirit of the kingdom, though dimmed, was never entirely extinguished. The Ulster cycle thus drew to its close with the same mixture of triumph and tragedy that had marked its beginning. The heroes of the Red Branch had achieved immortality through their deeds, but the kingdom they had served so faithfully was entering its twilight years. The age of heroes was ending, and a new era was dawning in Ireland, one that would be shaped by different forces and different dreams. As the mists of time gathered around the halls of Éman Macha, and the songs of the bards grew faint in the evening air, the legacy of the Ulster cycle lived on in the hearts and minds of the Irish people. The stories of Tuatha and Conquest, of Deirdre and the sons of Uisnech, of the great Táin and the heroes who fought in it, became part of the eternal mythology of Ireland, inspiring new generations of storytellers and dreamers. As the echoes of the Ulster cycle faded into legend, a new chapter in Ireland's royal history began to unfold. In the sacred halls of Tara, where the High Kings of Ireland held court, there rose a figure who would embody the ideals of kingship in a way that few before or after him would achieve. Cormac mac Airt, whose reign would become synonymous with wisdom, justice, and prosperity, ascended to the throne of Tara in circumstances that seemed touched by the hand of fate itself. The young prince, who would become Ireland's wisest king, was born into a world still reeling from the heroic conflicts of the previous age. His grandfather, Khan of the 100 Battles, had been one of the great warrior kings of Ireland, his reign marked by constant warfare and the expansion of his kingdom's influence. Yet Cormac would prove that true greatness lay not in the sword, but in the application of wisdom to the art of governance. The story of Cormac's rise to power begins with an act of injustice that would ultimately lead to the restoration of rightful rule. When Cormac's father, Airt Macwin, was slain in battle at Magmuc Ramar, the throne of Terra was usurped by Lugh Macwin, a pretender whose claim was based on force rather than right. The young Cormac, still a child, was forced to flee with his mother to the safety of distant relatives, his birthright stolen by the ambitions of lesser men. For 30 years. Lugh Mac Khan ruled from Terra, his reign marked by the kind of arbitrary justice and harsh rule that marked the illegitimate king. Yet the land itself seemed to reject his authority, for during his reign the crops failed, the cattle sickened, and the very elements appeared to conspire against the usurper. The ancient Irish believed that the legitimacy of a king could be measured by the prosperity of his kingdom, and by this measure, Lugh's rule was found wanting. The return of Cormac to Terra was as dramatic as any tale from the heroic cycles. The young prince, now grown to manhood and skilled in the arts of war and governance, appeared one day at the great assembly of Terra. A dispute had arisen over the ownership of a flock of sheep that had strayed onto the queen's land and eaten her crops. King Lugh, in his harsh justice, decreed that the sheep should be forfeit to the queen as compensation for the damage they had caused. Yet Cormac, speaking from the crowd, challenged this judgment with words that would become famous throughout Ireland. No, he declared. The shearing of the sheep is sufficient compensation for the grazing of the land, for both sheep and land will recover. The wisdom of this judgment was immediately apparent to all who heard it, for it showed an understanding of true justice that went beyond mere punishment to encompass the restoration of balance. The very earth seemed to respond to Cormac's words, for at that moment one side of the great hall of Terra collapsed, as if the building itself recognized the superiority of the young prince's judgment. The assembled nobles, seeing this sign and recognizing the wisdom of Cormac's words, acclaimed him as the rightful king. Lugh Mac Khan, his legitimacy finally and definitively challenged, was forced to flee, and Cormac Mac Airt took his place upon the throne of Terra. The reign of Cormac Mac Airt, which would last for 40 years, marked the beginning of what many consider the golden age of Irish kingship. Under his rule, Ireland experienced a period of peace and prosperity that had been unknown since the earliest days of the island's settlement. The king's wisdom became legendary, his judgments sought after by rulers from distant lands, and his court at Terra became a centre of learning and culture that rivaled any in Europe. One of Cormac's first acts as king was to establish a new code of laws that would govern the conduct of his subjects. These laws, known as the Brehon laws, were based on the principle of restorative rather than punitive justice. Rather than simply punishing wrongdoers, the laws sought to restore the balance that had been disrupted by their actions. This revolutionary approach to justice would influence Irish law for centuries to come. The wisdom of Cormac was not limited to legal matters alone. He was a patron of learning and the arts, gathering around him the greatest scholars, poets, and craftsmen of his age. The court of Terra became a place where knowledge was valued as highly as gold. and where the preservation and transmission of Ireland's cultural heritage was given the highest priority. It was during Cormac's reign that many of the great cycles of Irish literature were first committed to writing, ensuring their preservation for future generations. The king's own literary works, particularly his instructions to princes, became classics of political wisdom that were studied long after his death. In these writings, Cormac laid out his philosophy of kingship, emphasizing the ruler's responsibility to his people and the importance of justice, mercy, and wisdom in governance. His words would influence generations of Irish rulers and would be quoted by scholars throughout Europe. Under Cormac's rule, Ireland experienced unprecedented prosperity. The king's wise policies encouraged trade and commerce, and Irish goods began to find markets throughout Europe. The famous Irish metalworkers, whose skills were already renowned, reached new heights of artistry under royal patronage. The intricate designs and superior craftsmanship of Irish gold and silver work became sought after by rulers and nobles from Scotland to Rome. Agriculture, too, flourished under Cormac's wise governance. The king instituted new farming techniques and encouraged the cultivation of new crops, leading to increased yields and greater food security for his people. The ancient Irish saying that the land prospers under a righteous king was never more true than during Cormac's reign, when the very earth seemed to respond to his just rule with abundance. The cultural achievements of Cormac's reign were equally impressive. The king was himself a skilled poet and musician, and his court became a centre for the development of Irish music and literature. The great fairs of terror held during his reign were not merely commercial gatherings but cultural festivals where poets, musicians, and storytellers from throughout Ireland would gather to share their art and compete for royal patronage. It was during one of these fairs that Cormac first encountered the woman who would become his queen and the mother of his children. Eithentanias, daughter of a minor king from the province of Munster, was renowned for her beauty and intelligence. Their marriage was not merely a political alliance, but a true partnership, with Ethan serving as her husband's closest advisor and confidant. Together, Cormac and Ethan raised a family that would continue the tradition of wise rule. Their son, Cerba Leifacair, would succeed his father as High King, while their daughter, Grain, would become one of the most famous women in Irish legend. Her story intertwined with that of Finn, Mac Cumhaill, and the Fianna. The military achievements of Cormac's reign were as impressive as his peaceful accomplishments, though he was known primarily as a king of peace. Cormac was also a skilled warrior who successfully defended Ireland against numerous invasions. His victories were achieved not through mere force of arms, but through superior strategy and the loyalty of his subjects, who were willing to fight for a king who had proven himself worthy of their devotion. The most famous of Cormac's military campaigns was his expedition to Scotland, where he aided the Scottish king Fergus Mac Airt in establishing his rule. This campaign not only demonstrated Cormac's military prowess, but also established important diplomatic ties between Ireland and Scotland that would endure for centuries. The alliance forged during this campaign would prove crucial in later conflicts with common enemies. As Cormac's reign progressed, his reputation for wisdom spread far beyond the shores of Ireland. Foreign kings and princes sought his counsel, and diplomatic missions from distant lands became common sights at the Court of Terror. The king's judgments in international disputes were considered so fair and wise that he was often called upon to arbitrate conflicts between neighboring kingdoms. One of the most famous of these international arbitrations involved a dispute between the kings of Scotland and Britain over the ownership of certain islands. Cormac's solution, which involved the division of the islands based on their natural resources and strategic value, was so equitable that both sides accepted it without reservation. This judgment became a model for international diplomacy and was studied by legal scholars throughout Europe. The echoes of ancient glory still resonated through the halls of terror, where the High Kings of Ireland had ruled for centuries beyond memory. As the legendary age began its slow descent into the mists of time, new dynasties would rise to claim the throne that had been blessed by gods and contested by heroes. In the shadows of the great hill of terror, where the Liafail had once cried out in recognition of true kings, the bloodlines of the ancient rulers grew thin and scattered. The descendants of Khan of the 100 Battles and Niall of the 9 Hostages continued to press their claims. But the world around them was changing in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. King Muirchertach Mac Urke, whose reign marked the end of the 5th century, stood as one of the last great kings of the purely legendary tradition. His court at Terra still maintained the ancient customs, where druids whispered counsel and bards sang of deeds that blurred the line between history and myth. Yet even in his time, new currents were stirring across the Irish Sea, bringing with them a faith that would transform the very soul of Ireland. Muirchertach's reign was marked by the traditional pursuits of kingship, the hosting of great assemblies, the settlement of disputes between the Tuatha, and the maintenance of the delicate balance between the 5 provinces of Ireland. His warriors still carried the names of heroes, his druids still read omens in the flight of birds, and his poets still recited the genealogies that connected his bloodline to the gods themselves. But beneath the surface of this ancient order, change was taking root. Christian missionaries, following in the footsteps of the great Patrick, had begun to establish monasteries and churches throughout the island. The old ways did not die easily, and for generations the new faith would blend with the ancient beliefs, creating a unique synthesis that would define Irish culture for centuries to come. The court of Muirchertach exemplified this transition. While he maintained the sacred kingship traditions of his ancestors, he also showed favor to the Christian clerics who sought to establish their faith in his realm. The ancient rituals of inauguration were still performed, but they were increasingly accompanied by Christian blessings. The Druids still advised the king, but their counsel was now shared with bishops and abbots who spoke of a different kind of divine authority. During his reign, Muirchertach faced challenges that would have been familiar to his legendary predecessors. The Ugaine descendants of the ancient Ulster kingdom pressed their claims in the north. The Connachta inheritors of Queen Meb's legacy stirred in the west, and from across the sea came raiders and settlers, some seeking land, others seeking souls for their new god. The king's response to these challenges followed the ancient patterns. He gathered his warriors, many of whom bore names that echoed through legend, descendants of the Fianna, inheritors of the Ulster heroes, scions of the Tuatha, the Danann. But their swords were increasingly blessed by Christian priests as well as druids, and their victories were attributed to both the old gods and the new dot. As Muirchertach's reign progressed, the very nature of kingship began to evolve. The sacred marriage to the land goddess remained, but it was now understood through Christian allegory as well as pagan symbolism. The king's duty to ensure the fertility of the realm was unchanged, but the methods by which he fulfilled this obligation were adapting to a new spiritual landscape. The great festivals of the Celtic Ysewin, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugh continued to be celebrated at Terra. but they were gradually being transformed by Christian influence. The thin places where the Otherworld touched the mortal realm were becoming sites of Christian pilgrimage, as well as pagan worship. The ancient wells sacred to the goddesses were being blessed by saints, and the old oaths sworn by both the gods of the Tuatha, the Danann, and the new Christian Trinity. Muirchertach's death marked the end of an era in ways that would only become clear with the passage of centuries. His funeral was conducted according to the ancient rites, with keening women and warrior guards, with the ceremonial weapons of his ancestors and the sacred fires that had burned for generations. Yet Christian priests also attended, offering prayers for his soul, and blessing his passage to whatever realm awaited beyond the veil of death. The centuries that followed. Muirchertach's death saw the rise of dynasties that would bridge the gap between the legendary age and the historical period. These kings maintained the forms and ceremonies of their mythical predecessors, while adapting to the new realities of a Christianizing Ireland. Tuatha, whose name meant the legitimate, came to the throne in an age when legitimacy itself was being redefined. No longer was it sufficient to claim descent from the gods. Now kingship required the blessing of the church, as well as the recognition of the traditional assemblies. Tuatha's reign demonstrated the complex negotiations required to maintain royal authority in this changing world. The king's court at Terra became a fascinating blend of old and new. The ancient symbols of kingship, the talks of gold, the sacred weapons, the ritual cups remained in use. But they were now accompanied by Christian relics and symbols. The royal chaplain held a position of honor alongside the chief druid, and the king's judgments were informed by both Brehon law and Christian teaching. Tuatha's military campaigns followed the traditional patterns of Irish warfare, but they were increasingly influenced by Christian concepts of just war and divine sanction. His warriors still gathered in the ancient manner, with their clan banners and their hereditary weapons, but they now fought under standards blessed by bishops and carried relics of saints into battle. The administrative structures of the kingdom also evolved during this period. The traditional system of client kings and tributary rulers remained, but it was gradually being supplemented by ecclesiastical territories and monastic foundations. The old boundary stones and sacred groves were still respected, but they were joined by crosses and churches that marked the spiritual geography of the new faith. Tuatha's greatest achievement was perhaps his success in maintaining the unity of the high kingship while accommodating the diverse forces that were reshaping Irish society. He understood that the old ways could not simply be abandoned without destroying the very foundation of his authority. Yet he also recognized that the new faith offered opportunities for strengthening royal power and expanding the reach of central government. The assemblies at Terra during his reign were spectacular affairs that demonstrated this synthesis of traditions. The ancient protocol was maintained, the ritual approach to the sacred hill, the ceremonial seating according to rank and bloodline, the formal presentations of tribute and homage, but the proceedings were now opened with Christian prayer as well as Druidic invocation, and the king's pronouncements were blessed by both the old gods and the new. Trade and diplomacy also reflected this transitional character. Tuatha maintained the traditional exchange of hostages and tributes with the provincial kings, but he also established relationships with Christian kingdoms across the Irish Sea. Irish scholars and missionaries began to travel to continental Europe, carrying with them the unique blend of Celtic and Christian learning that would make Ireland famous throughout the medieval world. The king's marriage alliances followed both ancient and modern patterns. His wives were chosen for their bloodlines and their connections to the old nobility, but they were also selected for their support of the new faith. The royal household included both traditional women's councils and Christian abbesses, creating a complex network of female influence that reflected the changing role of women in Irish society. Tuatha's death and funeral exemplified the transitional nature of his reign. The ancient rituals were performed with full ceremony, the ritual keening, the warrior's vigil, the ceremonial breaking of his weapons, and the burning of his chariot. But Christian rites were also conducted, with prayers for his soul and masses for his spiritual welfare. His tomb became a site of pilgrimage for both those who honored the old ways and those who followed the new faith. As the 6th century dawned, Ireland stood at the threshold of a new age. The legendary kings who had ruled through the power of myth and magic were giving way to historical monarchs who would be recorded in annals and chronicles. Yet the final flowering of the legendary tradition produced some of the most remarkable figures in Irish royal history. King Diarmait represented the culmination of the legendary royal tradition. His reign, which spanned the middle decades of the 6th century, saw the last great expression of the ancient sacred kingship, while simultaneously witnessing the final transformation of that tradition into something entirely new. Diarmait's claim to the throne was impeccable by the standards of the legendary age. His genealogy traced back through unbroken lines to Niall of the 9 hostages and beyond to the gods themselves. The Druids proclaimed him the rightful heir, the stones of terror accepted his touch, and the sacred kingship ceremonies were performed with all the ancient splendor that had marked royal inaugurations for centuries beyond memory. Yet Diarmait's reign was also marked by the inexorable advance of Christian influence. The monasteries founded by Patrick and his successors had become centers of learning and power that rivaled the traditional royal courts. The new faith offered alternative sources of authority and legitimacy that challenged the ancient prerogatives of the sacred kings. The tension between old and new reached its climax during Diarmait's reign in the famous conflict with Saint Columba. The dispute began over a manuscript. The saint had copied a psalter without permission, and the king ruled that to every cow its calf, to every book its copy. This seemingly simple legal decision ignited a controversy that would have far-reaching consequences for the future of Irish kingship. The Battle of Cesair, fought in 561, was ostensibly a conflict between the king and the saints' royal allies, but it represented something far more significant: the clash between the old order and the new. Diarmait's forces, fighting under the ancient war cries and carrying the sacred weapons of their ancestors, met an enemy that fought with the blessing of the Christian God and the support of the new ecclesiastical order. The battle itself was fought according to the traditional patterns of Irish warfare. The warriors gathered in their clan formations, with their hereditary weapons and their ancestral battle cries. The Druids performed the ancient rituals of war magic, while the bards sang the deeds of heroes to inspire courage in the ranks. Yet the opposing forces were blessed by Christian priests, and the outcome was attributed to divine intervention rather than the favor of the old gods. Diarmait's victory was Pyrrhic in ways that would only become clear with time, while he maintained his throne and his authority. The conflict marked the beginning of the end for the purely legendary tradition of Irish kingship. The Church's growing influence could no longer be ignored or simply incorporated into the existing order. It demanded fundamental changes in the nature of royal authority itself. The later years of Diarmait's reign saw increasing accommodation with the Church, but also the gradual erosion of the sacred kingship traditions that had defined Irish royalty for centuries. The Druids were not expelled from court, but their influence waned as Christian advisors gained the king's ear. The ancient festivals were not abandoned, but they were increasingly Christianized and their original meanings forgotten or reinterpreted. The Great Assembly at Terra during Diarmait's reign was perhaps the last to be conducted according to the full ancient protocol. The provincial kings came with their traditional retinues. The Druids performed their ceremonies, and the bards recited the genealogies that connected the living to the divine. Yet Christian clerics also participated, offering prayers and blessings. That would have been unthinkable in earlier centuries. The spectacle was magnificent in its combination of ancient and modern elements. The sacred fire burned at the center of the assembly, tended by Druids whose knowledge stretched back to the time of the gods. Yet it was now blessed by Christian priests who saw in its flames a symbol of divine inspiration, the king's judgment. Seat was adorned with the traditional symbols of sovereignty, but it was also marked with the sign of the cross. Trade and diplomacy during Diarmait's reign reflected the changing nature of Irish society. The traditional exchange of hostages and tribute continued, but it was supplemented by ecclesiastical relationships and scholarly exchanges. Irish monks and scholars were beginning to travel throughout Europe, carrying with them the unique synthesis of Celtic and Christian learning that would make Ireland famous as the land of saints and scholars. The king's household evolved to accommodate these changes. The traditional Royal Women's Council was joined by Christian abbesses and holy women, who brought new perspectives on queenship and royal authority. The royal children were educated by both Druids and Christian teachers, learning the ancient law alongside the new faith in a synthesis that would define Irish culture for centuries to come. Diarmait's death in 565 marked the end of an era in Irish history. His funeral was conducted according to the ancient rites, with all the ceremony and splendor that had marked royal obsequies for centuries. The warriors performed their traditional vigil, the Druids conducted their sacred rituals, and the bards sang the laments that had echoed through the halls of Terra since time immemorial. Yet, even in death, the transition was evident. Christian prayers were offered for the king's soul. Masses were said for his spiritual welfare, and his tomb became a site of pilgrimage for both those who honored the old ways and those who followed the new faith. The legendary age of Irish kingship was drawing to a close, but its influence would continue to shape Irish culture and identity for generations to come. The final centuries of the legendary age saw the emergence of kings who existed at the very boundary between myth and history. These rulers maintained the forms and ceremonies of their mythical predecessors, while adapting to a world that was rapidly changing around them. Their reigns marked the end of the purely legendary tradition and the beginning of the historical period of Irish kingship. Airt and Mark, who ruled in the late 6th century, exemplified the challenges facing the last of the legendary kings. His claim to the throne was based on the traditional genealogies and the ancient rites of his dynasty, yet he ruled in a world where Christian influence was becoming increasingly dominant. His reign demonstrated both the persistence of the old traditions and their gradual transformation in the face of new realities. The court of Airt at Terra maintained many of the ancient customs, but they were increasingly modified by Christian influence. The traditional ceremonies of kingship were still performed, but they were now accompanied by Christian rituals and blessings. The Druids still advised the king, but their counsel was balanced by that of Christian clerics who brought different perspectives on royal authority and divine sanction. The military campaigns of Airt followed the traditional patterns of Irish warfare, but they were increasingly influenced by Christian concepts of just war and divine intervention. His warriors still gathered under the ancient banners and carried the hereditary weapons of their clans, but they now fought under standards. Blessed by bishops and carried relics of saints into battle, the administrative structures of the kingdom also evolved during this period. The traditional system of client kings and tributary rulers remained, but it was supplemented by ecclesiastical territories and monastic foundations. The old boundary stones and sacred groves were still respected, but they were joined by crosses, and churches that marked the spiritual geography of the new faith. Byton's greatest challenge came from the increasing power of the church and its alternative claims to authority. The monastic foundations established by Patrick and his successors had become centers of learning and influence that rivaled the traditional royal courts. The bishops and abbots who led these institutions claimed authority that derived not from bloodline or conquest, but from divine appointment and spiritual power. The tension between royal and ecclesiastical authority came to a head during Byton's reign in disputes over land ownership, legal jurisdiction, and the right to tax and tribute. The traditional Brehon law, which had governed Irish society for centuries, was increasingly challenged by canon law and Christian teaching. The king's role as the final arbiter of disputes was questioned by those who claimed higher authority from the Christian God. Despite these challenges, Byton's reign saw remarkable achievements in the integration of old and new traditions. The Great Assembly at Terra during his time was a masterpiece of synthesis, combining ancient and modern elements in a ceremony that satisfied both traditionalists and reformers. The sacred fire burned alongside Christian candles, the Druids. Invocations were matched by Christian prayers, and the king's pronouncements were blessed by both the old gods and the new. The cultural flowering of Byton's reign was particularly remarkable. The court became a center of learning where Christian scholars worked alongside traditional bards and druids. The ancient oral traditions were beginning to be written down, preserving for future generations the stories and genealogies that had been passed down through countless generations. The synthesis of Celtic and Christian learning that emerged during this period would make Ireland famous throughout the medieval world. Trade and diplomacy during Byton's reign reflected the changing nature of Irish society. The traditional exchange of hostages and tribute continued, but it was supplemented by ecclesiastical relationships and scholarly exchanges. Irish monks and scholars were traveling throughout Europe, carrying with them the unique blend of Celtic and Christian culture that would influence the development of medieval civilization. The king's household evolved to accommodate these changes. The traditional Royal Women's Council was joined by Christian abbesses and holy women who brought new perspectives on queenship and royal authority. The royal children were educated by both Druids and Christian teachers, learning the ancient lore alongside the new faith in a synthesis that would define Irish culture for centuries to come. Byton's death marked not just the end of a reign, but the end of an entire era in Irish history. His funeral was conducted according to the ancient rites, with all the ceremony and splendor that had marked royal obsequies for centuries. The warriors performed their traditional vigil, the druids conducted their sacred rituals, and the bards sang the laments that had echoed through the halls of Terra since time immemorial. Yet even in death, the transition was evident. Christian prayers were offered for the king's soul, masses were said for his spiritual welfare, and his tomb became a site of pilgrimage for both those who honored the old ways and those who followed the new faith. The legendary age of Irish kingship was drawing to a close. but its influence would continue to shape Irish culture and identity for generations to come. As the 7th century dawned, the nature of Irish kingship had been fundamentally transformed. The legendary kings who had ruled through the power of myth and magic were giving way to historical monarchs who would be recorded in annals and chronicles. Yet the transition was not complete. The forms and ceremonies of the ancient tradition persisted, adapted to new circumstances and new beliefs. The kings who ruled during this transitional period faced unique challenges. They had to maintain the loyalty of followers who still believed in the old ways while accommodating the demands of the new faith. They had to preserve the ancient sources of their authority while adapting to new forms of legitimacy. They had to rule over a society that was rapidly changing while maintaining the stability and continuity that kingship required. The solution that emerged was a remarkable synthesis of old and new traditions. The ancient ceremonies of kingship were preserved, but they were Christianized and given new meanings. The Druids were not expelled from court, but their influence was balanced by that of Christian clerics. The old laws were not abandoned, but they were supplemented by Christian teaching and canon law. This synthesis was perhaps most evident in the inauguration ceremonies of the kings of this period. The ancient rituals were still performed: the ritual marriage to the land goddess, the symbolic consumption of the sacred meal, the ceremonial reception of the royal insignia. But these pagan elements were now accompanied by Christian rites, the blessing of the bishops, the anointing with holy oil, the oath to defend the faith. The result was a uniquely Irish form of Christian kingship that preserved the sacred character of royal authority while adapting it to the requirements of the new faith. The king remained the earthly representative of divine power, but that power was now understood to derive from the Christian God as well as the ancient deities. The royal inauguration was still a sacred ceremony, but it was now blessed by Christian priests as well as pagan druids. The court life of these transitional kings reflected this synthesis in countless ways. The traditional royal household was maintained with its hierarchy of nobles, warriors, and servants, but it was now supplemented by Christian clerics and scholars. The ancient festivals were still celebrated, but they were gradually Christianized, and their original meanings reinterpreted. The Royal Women's Council continued to play its traditional role, but it was now joined by Christian abbesses and holy women. The military organization of these kingdoms also evolved during this period. The traditional war bands remained, with their hereditary weapons and their clan loyalties, but they were now blessed by Christian priests and fought under standards marked with the sign of the cross. The ancient battle cries were still raised, but they were now accompanied by Christian prayers and hymns. The legal systems of these kingdoms underwent similar transformations. The traditional Brehon law remained in force, with its complex system of compensation and its emphasis on maintaining social harmony, but it was increasingly supplemented by Christian teaching and canon law. The king's role as the final arbiter of disputes was maintained, but it was now understood to derive from divine appointment as well as traditional authority. The economic foundations of these kingdoms also changed during this period. The traditional system of tribute and redistribution continued, but it was now supplemented by ecclesiastical tithes and monastic wealth. The royal treasury was still fed by the traditional sources: tribute from client kings, fines from legal proceedings, profits from trade and raiding, but it was now also enriched by donations from Christian converts and support from ecclesiastical institutions. The cultural life of these kingdoms was particularly rich during this transitional period. The traditional oral culture of the bards and storytellers was gradually giving way to a written culture dominated by Christian scholars and monks. The ancient stories and genealogies were being written down for the first time, preserving them for future generations, but also subtly transforming them in the process. The synthesis of Celtic and Christian learning that emerged during this period would make Ireland famous throughout the medieval world as the land of saints and scholars. The diplomatic relations of these kingdoms also reflected the changing nature of Irish society. The traditional exchange of hostages and tribute between Irish kingdoms continued, but it was now supplemented by ecclesiastical relationships and scholarly exchanges. Irish monks and scholars were traveling throughout Europe, carrying with them the unique blend of Celtic and Christian culture that would influence the development of medieval civilization. The gradual transformation of Irish kingship during this period was not without its tensions and conflicts. Some nobles and warriors remained loyal to the old ways and resented the growing influence of the church. Some Christian clerics, in turn, viewed the persistence of pagan traditions with suspicion and sought to eliminate them entirely. The kings of this period had to navigate these conflicting pressures while maintaining the unity and stability of their realms. Despite these challenges, the synthesis that emerged during this transitional period proved remarkably durable. The Christianized form of Irish kingship that developed during the 7th and 8th centuries would persist for centuries, adapting to new circumstances and new challenges while maintaining its essential character. The legendary kings may have passed into history, but their influence would continue to shape Irish culture and identity for generations to come. As the purely legendary age of Irish kingship drew to a close, the influence of the mythical rulers who had dominated Irish imagination for centuries continued to shape the culture and identity of the island. Their stories, preserved in the oral traditions of the bards and gradually written down by Christian scribes, became the foundation of Irish literary and cultural tradition. The genealogies that traced royal bloodlines back to the gods themselves remained important sources of political legitimacy even as the nature of kingship changed. The great dynasties continued to claim descent from the legendary kings, and these claims were taken seriously by both supporters and opponents. The Ugaine traced their lineage back to Niall of the 9 hostages. The Ugaine claimed descent from Egon Mora, and the Díl Riata maintained their connection to the legendary kings of Ulster. The stories of the legendary kings also continued to provide models for royal behavior and ideals of leadership. The wisdom of Solomon paled beside the judgment of Cormac mac Airt. The courage of Alexander seemed modest compared to the valor of Khan of the 100 battles, and the piety of Constantine was overshadowed by the spiritual authority of the sacred kings of terror. These legendary figures set standards for kingship that would influence Irish rulers for centuries to come. The legal traditions associated with the legendary kings also persisted into the historical period. The Brehon law, which was said to have been codified by the ancient kings, continued to govern Irish society long after the coming of Christianity. The complex system of compensation and the emphasis on maintaining social harmony reflected the wisdom of the legendary rulers who had established these traditions. Centuries earlier, the cultural achievements of the legendary kings also left a lasting legacy. The patronage of learning and the arts that had characterized the courts of terror and Cassiel continued to influence Irish culture throughout the medieval period. The synthesis of warrior valor and scholarly wisdom that had defined the ideal of the legendary king became a distinctive feature of Irish civilization. The religious traditions associated with the legendary kings underwent the most significant transformation during this period. The sacred kingship that had connected the rulers to the gods of the Tuatha de Danann was gradually Christianized, but it was not abandoned. The anointing of kings with holy oil replaced the ritual marriage to the land goddess. But the concept of the king as the earthly representative of divine power remained central to Irish political thought. That the geographical associations of the legendary kings also persisted into the historical period. Tara remained the symbolic centre of Irish kingship, even as the actual seat of power shifted to other locations. The ancient assembly sites continued to be used for royal inaugurations and important ceremonies, maintaining the connection between the present and the legendary past. The military traditions of the legendary kings also influenced the development of Irish warfare. The concept of the warrior king, who led his men into battle and earned his authority through personal courage and martial skill, remained central to Irish political culture. The war bands that had served the legendary kings evolved into the military households of the historical period, maintaining their traditions of loyalty and honor. The economic foundations of the legendary kingdoms also left their mark on Irish society. The system of tribute and redistribution that had characterized the rule of the ancient kings continued to define the relationship between rulers and subjects. The emphasis on generosity and hospitality that had been a hallmark of the legendary courts remained an important aspect of Irish kingship throughout the medieval period. The diplomatic traditions of the legendary kings also influenced the development of Irish political culture. The complex system of alliances and hostages that had characterized the relationships between the ancient kingdoms continued to shape Irish politics. The emphasis on honor and reputation that had been central to the legendary king's authority remained important in the historical period. The artistic and literary traditions associated with the legendary kings also persisted into the historical period. The patronage of bards and storytellers that had characterized the ancient courts continued to influence Irish culture. The stories of the legendary kings became the foundation of Irish literature, inspiring poets and writers for centuries to come. The architectural traditions of the legendary kings also left their mark on Irish civilization. The great royal sites of Tara, Cashel, and Cruachan continued to be important centers of power and ceremony. The circular earthworks and stone monuments that had characterized the legendary kingdoms influenced the development of Irish architecture and urban planning. The educational traditions of the legendary kings also persisted into the historical period. The emphasis on learning and scholarship that had characterized the ancient courts continued to influence Irish culture. The Druids who had served the legendary kings evolved into the scholars and teachers of the Christian period, maintaining their traditions of knowledge and wisdom. The influence of the legendary kings on Irish identity was perhaps their most important legacy. The stories of their deeds and the ideals they represented became central to Irish cultural consciousness. The image of the heroic king, defending his people against enemies and maintaining justice and prosperity, became a defining feature of Irish national identity. This legacy was not confined to Ireland itself. As Irish monks and scholars travelled throughout Europe, they carried with them the stories and traditions of the legendary kings. The unique blend of Celtic and Christian culture that had emerged in Ireland influenced the development of medieval civilization across the continent. The persistence of the legendary king's influence into the historical period demonstrates the power of myth and tradition in shaping human culture. Even as the actual nature of kingship changed, the ideals and images associated with the legendary rulers continued to provide meaning and inspiration. The transition from the legendary age to the historical period was not a clean break, but a gradual evolution that preserved the essential elements of the older tradition while adapting them to new circumstances. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the mist rises from the sacred waters and the ancient stones stand silent in the grey light, the spirits of the legendary kings still walk the hills of Ireland. They are not gone, these rulers of myth and memory, but have become part of the very landscape they once commanded. Their voices echo in the wind that sweeps across the plains of Meath. Their presence lingers in the shadows of the great earthworks where they held court, and their wisdom flows like underground rivers through the consciousness of their people, the Hill of Terror. Where so many of these legendary figures were crowned and buried, remains a place of pilgrimage and wonder. The tourists who climb its modest slopes today cannot know that they walk in the footsteps of gods disguised as men, or that the earth beneath their feet is heavy with the dreams of ages. The archaeologists who study its monuments and the historians who analyze its records can catalogue the physical remnants of the legendary age, but they cannot capture the essence of what was lost when the last of the sacred kings passed from the world. Yet perhaps nothing was truly lost, for the stories survive, and in the survival of stories lies the immortality of the human spirit. In the manuscripts preserved in libraries across Europe, in the oral traditions passed down from generation to generation, in the place names and customs that still mark the Irish landscape, the legendary kings continue to live. They have become part of the mythology not just of Ireland, but of the world's symbols of a time when the boundary between the mortal and the divine was thin, when kings could speak with gods and heroes could change the course of history through the sheer force of their will. The transformation of these legendary figures from historical rulers to mythical archetypes reflects the deep human need for heroes and ideals. In an age of pragmatism and skepticism, when the mystery has been drained from much of human experience, the legendary kings of Ireland offer a glimpse of a world where magic was real, where honor mattered more than profit, and where the individual could achieve greatness through courage and nobility of spirit. Their influence extends far beyond the borders of Ireland. The Celtic revival movements of the 18th and 19th centuries drew heavily on the stories of the legendary kings, finding in them a source of national pride and cultural identity. The Romantic poets and writers who celebrated the Celtic past saw in these ancient rulers models of nobility and heroism that contrasted sharply with the materialism and conformity of their own age. The modern Irish state has also drawn on the legacy of the legendary kings, the symbols of Irish nationhood, the harp, the shamrock, the Celtic crosshaw echo the imagery associated with the ancient rulers. The ideals of Irish independence and self-determination are rooted in the memory of a time when Irish kings ruled their own lands according to their own laws, free from foreign domination. But the influence of the legendary kings extends beyond politics and nationalism. Their stories have become part of the global heritage of human storytelling, inspiring writers and artists across cultures and centuries. The themes they embodied: the struggle between good and evil, the importance of honor and loyalty, the possibility of transcendence through heroic action, are universal human concerns that resonate across time and space. The psychological impact of these legendary figures is perhaps even more significant than their cultural influence. They represent archetypes of leadership and heroism that speak to deep-seated human needs and aspirations. In a world where authority is often questioned and heroes are rare, the legendary kings offer models of what leadership can be when it is grounded in wisdom, courage, and service to others. The spiritual dimension of their legacy is equally important. The sacred kingship that they embodied represented a vision of political authority that was grounded in divine sanction and moral responsibility. While the specific forms of this sacred kingship may seem foreign to modern sensibilities, the underlying principle that power must be exercised with wisdom and for the benefit of all remains relevant to contemporary discussions of governance and leadership. The artistic legacy of the legendary kings is also significant. The stories of their deeds inspired countless works of art, from the illuminated manuscripts of the medieval period to the paintings and sculptures of the modern era. The imagery associated with their reigns, the golden torques, the sacred swords, the royal banners house, become part of the visual vocabulary of Celtic culture. The literary influence of the legendary kings extends far beyond Ireland. Their stories have been translated into dozens of languages and have influenced writers from across the globe. The themes and motifs associated with their reigns, the quest for the Grail, the doomed love affair, the heroic last stand have become staples of world literature. The educational value of their stories is also considerable. The legendary kings provide a window into the values and beliefs of ancient Celtic society, offering insights into a worldview that was fundamentally different from our own. Their stories teach us about the importance of honor, loyalty, and courage, while also illustrating the dangers of pride, ambition, and the abuse of power. The therapeutic potential of these ancient narratives should not be overlooked. In an age of anxiety and uncertainty, the stories of the legendary kings offer a sense of continuity and purpose. They remind us that human beings have always faced challenges and difficulties, and that heroism and nobility are possible even in the darkest of times. The ecological dimension of their legacy is also worth considering. The legendary kings were portrayed as being in harmony with the natural world, understanding their role as stewards of the land rather than its masters. This ancient wisdom has new relevance in an age of environmental crisis, offering alternative models of the relationship between human society and the natural world. The technological revolution of the modern era has given new life to the stories of the legendary kings. Through film, television, and digital media, their tales can be shared with audiences that previous generations could never have imagined. The internet has made their stories accessible to people across the globe, creating new communities of interest and appreciation. Yet, for all the ways in which the legendary kings have been adapted and reinterpreted, their essential appeal remains unchanged. They represent the human aspiration to transcend the limitations of ordinary existence, to achieve greatness through noble action, and to leave a legacy that will inspire future generations. In an age that often seems cynical and materialistic, they offer a vision of what human life can be when it is lived with purpose and dedication to high ideals. The seasonal cycles that governed the ancient Celtic world continue to turn, indifferent to human ambition and achievement. Spring still follows winter, summer gives way to autumn, and the wheel of the year continues its eternal rotation. But within these natural cycles, the stories of the legendary kings have found their own form of immortality, passed down from one generation to the next, like precious heirlooms that never lose their luster in the end. The legendary kings of Ireland achieved something that few rulers in history have managed. They became myths while remaining human. They entered the realm of legend while keeping their connection to the earth and its people. Their stories continue to inspire and challenge us, reminding us that greatness is possible, that honor matters, and that the human spirit can triumph over the forces of darkness and despair. The mists that shroud the Irish landscape are lifting. now revealing the green fields and ancient stones beneath. But the mystery remains, and will always remain, as long as human beings long for heroes and dream of greatness. In that eternal longing, the legendary kings of Ireland live on, their voices carried on the wind, their spirits dwelling in the land they loved, their legacy woven into the very fabric of human consciousness. And so the story ends where it began, in the realm of legend and memory, where the boundary between the mortal and the divine grows thin, and where the echoes of ancient greatness still resonate in the hearts of those who have ears to hear. The legendary kings of Ireland are gone, but they are not forgotten. They have become part of the eternal story of human aspiration and achievement, part of the great tapestry of myth and memory that gives meaning to our lives and hope to our dreams. In the silence that follows the telling of their tales, we can still hear their voices, still feel their presence, still draw inspiration from their example. They are the legendary kings of Ireland, and their story will never truly end. For as long as there are those who remember, they will continue to live, to inspire, and to remind us of the greatness that lies within the human heart. The wind carries their names across the centuries: Nuada of the silver hand, Lugh of the long arm, Khan of the 100 battles, Cormac mac Airt, Niall of the 9 hostages. They echo through the halls of memory, these names, like the sound of distant trumpets, calling us to honor and noble action. The legendary kings of Ireland have taken their place among the immortals, not because they were perfect, but because they dared to dream of perfection, not because they never failed, but because they failed with nobility and rose again with courage. In the gathering twilight, as the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, we can feel their presence still. They are there in the whisper of the wind through the ancient oaks, in the soft murmur of the streams that flow through the sacred valleys, in the silence that settles over the land like a benediction. The legendary kings of Ireland have become part of the landscape of the soul, part of the geography of the heart, part of the eternal story that connects us all to something greater than ourselves. And in that connection, in that sense of belonging to something larger and more enduring than our individual lives, lies the true legacy of the legendary kings. They remind us that we are all part of a continuing story, that our actions matter, that our choices have consequences that extend far beyond our own lifetimes. They teach us that heroism is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act courageously in spite of fear, that leadership is not about power over others, but about service to a cause greater than ourselves. The legendary kings of Ireland live on, not in the dusty pages of history books or the carefully preserved artifacts of museums, but in the living memory of a people who have never forgotten the power of a good story well told. They live on in the songs of the bards, in the prayers of the pilgrims, in the dreams of the children who hear their tales for the first time. They live on because they represent something essential in the human spirit, something that no amount of skepticism or cynicism can destroy. As the last echoes of their story fade into the quiet night, we are left with the knowledge that some things are eternal, that some truths transcend time, and that some legends are too powerful to die. The legendary kings of Ireland have achieved the only immortality that matters. They have become part of the consciousness of humanity, part of the great story that we tell ourselves about who we are and who we can become. In the end, that is enough, more than enough. It is everything. Asterisk, the ancient stones stand silent now, but their memory endures. The wind carries whispers of a golden age, when gods walked among men and heroes shaped the destiny of nations. In the heart of Ireland, in the soul of her people. The legendary kings live in eternal guardians of a dream that will never die. Asterisk, asterisk. If this journey through the mists of time has touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. Let the legends live on through you, and may the wisdom of the ancient kings guide your path through the modern world. The story continues, and you are part of it. Asterisk, asterisk.